You better be listening to Sleazoids or I must break you.
Kulvinsky's law states, treat everybody the same, white, black, brown. Be civil to everyone, courteous to nobody. You're supposed to use equal force, you know?
Right?
Now, rule 2 of Kulvinsky's law is if a dude uses his fist, you use your stick. If he uses a knife, you use your gun. Cancel his ticket right then and there. Everything else fails, hit him with a brick, anything you can get your hands on.
Any cop who gives up his gun to some punk is a coward.
He's got a gun in my back. Give him yours, Carl.
9 p.m. Los Angeles, California. Petty criminals Greg Powell and Jimmy Smith forced police officers Ian Campbell and Carl Hettinger to an abandoned onion field.
We told you we were going to let you go, but have you ever heard of the Little Lindbergh Law?
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sleazoids, the podcast where we go down the rabbit hole of 20th century genre fare from the most influential canon classics to the trashiest exploitation films we can get our hands on. Invite you to tag along in helping us create a canon of sleaze. Each week is a double feature Grindhouse style where we discuss two films loosely related by subject, genre, actor, filmmaker, or franchise. And at the end of each episode, along with our honorary Sleazoids, which you can become by subscribing on Patreon.
Next week, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure we're doing possibly a Spike Lee adjacent movie or maybe even a Spike Lee movie. Not sure, but the suspense
they might have ruined that.
You.
I'll have to inform you at the end. This is going to be a huge stay tuned.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
We decided all the official ratings and rankings for every film that we cover as well. Patreon subscribers also get an honor shout out and 2 bonus episodes every single month, which we have been doing for like 7+ years, like 190 bonus episodes, as well as our bonus transmission series where we talk about new release genre films, which is like 60+ of. So if you haven't made the jump yet, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. We would recommend doing that for best enjoyment of the show. And also we are going to give our shout outs here. We had Keegan Harris sign up. We had Chekhov's Fingers, Alexis Pays, Alex M, Bobby Crowley, Carla Simpson, Flesh Colored Subaru. I do like when they just take advantage of the fact that I'm going to read them out on here. Jernfrau, James Francis signed up at the annual tier, got an entire year of the show at a monthly discounted rate. Welcome back, James. We had Raman Mirabel sign up, Jody, George Mitchens, Joe Madden, Henry, Nikki, Nathan Flynn, Shane, and last but not least, we had 2 people make the jump to the $10 a month tier as well and are joining us for the monthly virtual screenings, which was Juan Moreno and John Handel. So thanks so much to all you folks. We appreciate that support. I hope you're enjoying all those bonus episodes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
That's the one plug for the week. The other plug, as always, is Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're listening on either one of those platforms, give us a good old rating and review over there. It helps us climb the ranks and find new listeners. And the last plug, as always, is merch. If you like the poster art that based out of Toronto horror artist Trevor Henderson did for our show, you can get that put on basically anything that you freaks can think of. And that link is in the description of this episode, as well as, we have to add this in, we have brand new merch that we just launched last week. We just sold a bunch of it at our screening of Twisted Issues that we just did, but it was designed by our pal Brandon Lim of Black Belt Cinema. It is a beautiful blowout inspired design. Also, we had these chino twill sort of like dad caps made, and the links are already available online to purchase, and you guys have already almost sold us out of our first print run before we even printed them.
Thank you guys. Crazy.
So thank you so much already, and if you're interested in that, the link will be in the description of this episode there for those as well. It's our first big, really official merch drop that we went and had our graphic designer buddy do for us, and I think he did a pretty magnificent job. So
yeah, I love it.
Check it out if you are interested in that. But that is it for the intro. Welcome back another week. As always, I am your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me also, as always, is my co-host,
Jamie Miller. Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome. I believe 2 weeks ago would have been the last time you folks over on the main feed would have heard from us, where we would have actually, in conjunction with our screening of Charles Pinion's debut film, Twisted Issues, we would have had him back on the show to do an episode with us, a very cool pairing of a 1977 Grindhouse exploitation double feature he actually really watched in the drive-in as a teenager and found very inspirational. He talked Tentacle Tentacles with us from 1977, a very sort of post-Jaws sort of revenge of nature creature feature about a killer octopus. Weirdly kind of star-studded. John Huston and Henry Fonda are in this movie. It's kind of crazy. Shelley Winters is in it, and part of why he was so inspired by it was because he said it was so crummy. He watched a movie with big actors that was so ripping off another movie, and he thought it just sucked, and he didn't pay attention to it. But he paired it with a movie that it was paired with at that drive-in screening called Squirm, which was a really, really low-budget, really nasty revenge of nature about mutant worms who get electrified in the ground and start just eating people, and millions of worms filled in a room as a character opens a door and gets covered in them. And he watched that, nobody in it, nobody at all, and he was like, there's artistic craft there, and that's said to him, you can make no budget art.
Yeah, it's a really strange but really fun movie. Great makeup too. Eventually someone takes the worms kind of take over his body and becomes like a worm man and stuff. It's wild.
It's great. So if you haven't heard that pairing and our conversation with Charles, go back and check that out. That was 2 weeks ago over on the main feed. But then last week over on the bonus feed, like everyone else was getting into it, there is Naked Gun fever due to the newly released Liam Neeson and Pam Anderson remake by Akiva Schaffer of Lonely Island, who seems like the right guy to reboot sort of a sketch comedy series like this. And we realized we had never talked about the ZAZ guys outside of doing Kentucky Fried Movie somehow. So we were like, it's time. They're like, John Landis kind of fucked that up for us. We don't, please watch Airplane, please watch Naked Gun. So that was what we decided we were going to do last week over on the bonus feed, and we had a blast with that.
Yeah, it's just fun to remember how good those movies are. They are some of my favorite comedies. Just the nonstop gags, how silly they are willing to be. I love it so much.
Yeah, so if you haven't heard that episode, that was last week over on the Patreon. Go back and check that out. But moving on to this week, we are once again joined by a very special returning guest. He is the head of content over at The Ringer, as well as the host of the Big Picture podcast, the only other podcast brave enough to have Adam Naiman on as a regular correspondent. That guest is Sean Fennessey. Sean, welcome back, man.
Thanks, boys. Nice to see you. Very happy to be in good company on Naiman Island. It's a beautiful place.
I will say, every time every time you have him on, I go straight for the comments, and I'm very curious what everybody is saying, because I have never disagreed with anyone more than any time I do that. I'm like, and the Naiman episodes are usually my favorite ones. The one you guys did on Eddington, and when you had your interview with Ari Aster, I thought was fantastic. So
thank you. Adam is comfortably known as Mean Pod Guy whenever he joins the show, and he does bring some opinions that rankle, but he is legitimately the smartest person in contemporary film criticism.
He makes us feel bad every time he comes on. I'm like I don't think I know enough, but it's also good to have someone like that in your life to inspire you to want to know more. But you guys are also at a disadvantage. You always have him on to talk about new movies, and we not always, I guess, but we always are like, Adam, what are two of your favorite movies of all time? And so no one ever gets mad at him when he's just like, I love Shadow of a Doubt.
If he can lean into a classic, then he's less controversial for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. But Sean, we're so excited to have you back. It's been a little while since we had you, and I'm even struggling to remember. We had, was it Colossus the Forbin Project? Was the
and Colossus the Forbin Project, and we had Demon Seed. And when we did that,
that's right.
AI was a point of discussion in the world, but not like it is now. So if people go back and listen to that episode, we were kind of like predicting in some ways what it was really 50 years ago. I think we were on the money.
How scary this thing was about to be.
Yeah, I'm like, now I should. Maybe I got to re-record it. Maybe I got to go back and take a look at it and see what we said. But yeah, no, it was you. Every time we ask you to come on, I feel like you shoot 70s movies at us. 70s is kind of like the era you seem to be kind of going back to. And when I asked for a pairing for this one, you had kind of one specific author in mind. So who are we talking about today? What are the two films, and why did you pair them together?
Sure. Once again, very happy to be here and to be able to talk about these 70s movies with you. We're doing a double shot of Joseph Wambaugh today. He had two adaptations of two books that he wrote. The New Centurions, which comes from Richard Fleischer in 1972, and The Onion Field, which is a 1979 film from Harold Becker. They're interesting paired together because The New Centurions is a fictional novel that features lots of real life experience, and The Onion Field is a nonfiction book that features lots of fictionalized experience. So should be cool.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, no, I had actually, it's so funny. I had vaguely heard of this author, but I never read any of his books. And watching these two films, they are so clearly, I have an idea of what it is that this guy was very interested in. And when we were saying that we were talking about New Centurions, I had forgotten what the other film was that you had mentioned when we were announcing the episode. And we were talking with Charles, and Charles was like, "Oh yeah, I know Joseph Wambaugh. I saw those movies when they came out." He's like, "You guys should do The Onion Field." I was like, "Oh, okay, maybe we will." Yeah, it was very, very funny when I looked it up and saw that was in your messages as well. That was what you want to talk about. Yeah. But these are both incredibly bleak and sad cop dramas by, an LAPD detective turned crime novelist, and they're both very authentically detailed about what sort of on the ground patrol work is like in this very gritty and often realistic and kind of unheroic way. And as a result, they kind of served also as these very depressing and sympathetic portraits of cop life and burnout and mental health and alcoholism and suicide. And, in some ways that are definitely very interesting and sort of unique for the genre. And sometimes also kind of drift into sentimental, weepy territory, which some people might take issue with, but I thought that these were both very, very interesting, and I'm glad you brought them on.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I come to this, as I mentioned to you before, as the son of a cop who didn't always have the greatest relationship with his cop dad. And in our culture right now, we have a very at least in the film criticism podcast community, not the most pro-cop world. Sure. And these movies make an effort, I think, to show an empathy for the experience, and they do sentimentalize it at times, but there is something so unbearably sad about the inner lives of these guys that feels very honest to a lot of people that I was exposed to. And while I don't necessarily come away from either of them feeling like cops are misunderstood per se, I do think that it is a slightly more artful way of portraying what is a very weird profession that we have accepted in our modern Western civilization as normal. And so, yeah, I think also these movies could never have been made in any other decade, and that you never would have, the way that both of these movies end, like you never would have been allowed to make a movie as like downbeat and borderline depressing as both of these films are. The endings of both films are kind of like, wait, what? This is over?
Yeah. The idea of these as bestsellers in pop entertainment is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, that's something that we've also discussed, particularly in this decade with the 70s, is the kind of, it's like they just allowed nihilistic and very dark, incredibly depressing endings to happen, even if it was supposed to be a very popular blockbuster. Another one was that we were discussing was just a bit ago was Night Moves, I think, with Gene Hackman. So yeah, there's a ton of them. I mean, we've listed them off.
Yeah, that was one where we recently had that conversation, which is a funny tie-in too, because that's the youngest James Woods we've ever talked about, and we actually brought up the fact that we're going to be talking about James Woods just a few years after Night Moves. So yeah, it's going to be fun. But yeah,
with that, a lot of empathy for in 2025, but who was electrifying in the 70s.
Definitely, yes,
absolutely. But yeah, with that being said, I think we're going to jump right into it here. So let's kick things off. Let's go chronologically here, and let's start with The New Centurions. Actually, this will also be his debut novel and his second novel too, if we do that order, so that works out. Let's do it.
Stop the car! Come on, I won't bust you! Stop it! What are you doing, you idiot? Get out! Die! Jump or I'll scrape you off! Crazy! Get off the car! Stop!
A cop tells his story in The New Centurions.
All right, we are talking The New Centurions, the 1972 crime drama thriller directed by Richard Fleischer, written by Sterling Silliphant, who was adapting, obviously, Joseph Wambaugh's 1971 debut novel, and starring Stacy Keach and George C. Scott as a sort of rookie cop and his veteran mentor, and a few other rookies of the academy who kind of learn lessons from George C. Scott's mentor, who has a lot of interesting things to convey about how it is he makes his hit through the night shift and makes it an enjoyable experience for them, but at the same time reveals over the course of the movie to have an incredibly sad and lonely life, and that is really, really dedicated to the work in a way that harms every other part of his life, something the younger characters kind of don't really figure out until much later. And yeah, we'll get into it, but both of these movies have a very sweeping sort of passage of time and a life lived kind of quality to them, which makes sense because Wambaugh obviously was writing these at the point where he had already been a cop and for like 15 years or something like that. But before we jump into all that, this is only our second or third time actually talking about legendary and prolific Hollywood filmmaker Richard Fleischer, the son of equally legendary cartoonist and animator Max Fleischer, who began his career, as many did, making B crime and noir pictures for RKO, and with titles like, these are so sick, Armored Car Robbery, Narrow Margin, Violent Saturday, before graduating to making bigger studio journeyman gigs like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which he did for Disney, his dad's rival, which is quite funny, The Vikings, Fantastic Voyage, Dr. Dolittle, and eventually settled into just being one of the most reliable genre stylists and like sturdy craftsmen of his time, who could bend himself basically to any type of film that you would ask for him. You need a war picture? Tora. He's got, you need a serial killer procedural, The Boston Strangler, which might even be my favorite movie of his, a sci-fi dystopia, Soylent Green. You know, you can go on. I forgot that he did Conan the Destroyer and Red Sandra, and this dude did the Amityville 3D movie. Like he would do anything. I'm
a huge fan of this. I think he's incredibly underrated as a for hire filmmaker from this era, and he is like alarmingly adaptable. I mean, he made the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea movie in the 50s, and then he made Mr. Majestic in the 70s. I mean, the idea that those two movies were from the same filmmaker is so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I only watched 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea for the first time a few years ago, and I was like, what a like gorgeous like Technicolor, like just, you know, Kirk Douglas singing with the seal, and like I was like, this is such a ridiculous movie, and how is this possibly like the same dude who did like Narrow Margin even was one we did as one of our virtual screenings, and as just a straight pure bullet of like a train thriller noir exercise. All of our, you know, watchers with us were equally flabbergasted. Like he has a lot of skill, and I think you see that in here. You see two different modes out of him. You really do see this kind of you know, sort of dramatic, naturalistic, observational sort of new Hollywood thing that he's obviously doing, but when it comes time to be like, no, you need a gunfight, no, you need a car chase, you need these other sort of exciting elements people expect of a movie like this, he's totally there for you as well. And so Fleischer kind of gives you both, even if you could feel a little bit of the producer's hand being like, Wambaugh, it's a little sad, man. You need to, can Stacy Keach like hang out of a car for like 5 minutes?
Well, I find that is the biggest studio note in the movie, is that car chase sequence roughly 3/4 of the way through the film is completely unrelated to any narrative that is surrounding the story, except they kind of use it as a portal to revealing that sadness that you talked about, that the Stacy Keach character doesn't totally clock in meeting with veterans of the police force in the first hour of the movie. It almost takes him on a drunken journey to realization, which is just, Fleischer is one of a very short list of people who could credibly communicate melancholy drama and high action in the same movie.
No, he makes perfect sense. When the producing duo here, which is Robert Chardoff and Irwin Winkler, who had just made Point Blank and They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And they would obviously go on to produce like the Rocky films, number of Scorsese films. They ended up being the ones to secure the rights to this brand new best-selling crime novelist, Joseph Wambaugh here. And Fleischer was a natural fit to realize it for them, because he was someone who could operate in whatever mode it was that they needed to him, especially because they weren't sure at first who was even going to adapt this novel, what shape it was actually going to take. And they ended up finding, or at least seeking out Sterling Silliphant, who, and also I guess Robert Towne, who did some sort of impromptu on the fly rewrites for them and stuff like that. But Silliphant was the sort of main adapter here, who got his career started doing classic noir stuff too, like Nightfall for Jacques Turner and Line Up for Don Siegel, and then obviously had recently just won an Oscar for Norman Jewison's In the Heat of the Night, which, you know, was another movie where he felt like he brought some tough genre procedure and class detail to what might have just been a simple lecture-y sort of Hollywood sort of social issues picture about a racist sheriff learning to, you know, respect a smart, educated black detective. And, you know, they even actually stole Quincy Jones from that production too, who did the music for that, because they were like, yeah, we need, you know, we want some of that groovy, funky sound, but it also needs to be like, you know, a Hollywood drama. So you need to be able to kind of switch those two modes together. And Quincy made a lot of sense.
Silliphant's a really good character for this show too, because he's got this incredibly varied slate of high prestige, and then eventually kind of gets drawn into writing high-end IP, for lack of a better word, you know, The Towering Inferno, and he writes Shaft in Africa, and he was buddies with Bruce Lee and trained with Bruce Lee, and he's like a really interesting bridge character between the respectable Hollywood and the genre Hollywood.
No, and I think he does a pretty good job translating his material, and also I'm assuming taking notes of being like, you need to deliver a little bit on the goods of people are going to see a cop movie with big actors in it, and we need to, you know, sort of promise what we can into there. And I felt similarly, I think, a little bit to, we had a conversation, I don't remember how long ago, Jamie, when did we talk about LA Confidential? That was a movie I thought about a little bit, but I thought about it.
It was only a year ago.
It might have been. It might have been that not that long ago. But it was something I thought about only because reading a little bit about the novel, I was like, oh, this was really cut down, and this was really, really focused. Sean, have you read the books? Do you love them?
I read. Okay. I haven't read the Wambaugh books. I've read all those Elroy books, and those books in that movie probably really locked me into getting interested in noir in the 90s in general. And the Wambaugh books, I think I probably cracked the Blue Knight after I first saw these movies. I don't usually go back and read novels after I've seen a film adaptation, even if it's significant. Gotcha. But I'm pretty sure I looked at the Blue Knight, which did eventually get adapted into a TV movie with William Holden. And
which he hated, apparently. I looked up.
Yeah. They're what you might expect. There is like a kind of flinty, quick moving narrative style, but there are also these passages of ruminative existential despair and self-pitying that go into characterizing just these sad guys who have this hard job. And I think that they're just really smartly drawn portraits of real life events, and people who have had genuine real life experience are actually few and far between as Hollywood writers. And Wambaugh providing all of this material against what he actually experienced, it is invariably biased toward the experience of being a police officer, but it is authentic in its way. And the writing style is like, I don't know if he's the most literary writer of all time, but he wrote page turners about cops. And
yeah, I mean, people were really taken with them, and I was surprised to see that, like, in movie form, they were turned more into sort of plotty films and sort of thrillery films at times, because, like, from what I could understand gleaning from sort of the summary of the novel, it was that really it was not like a mystery or a procedural. It was really just a psychological profile of three different cops who attended this academy in the early 60s, who essentially part ways and experience various sort of horrific things on the job that changed them, whether it's like working with juvenile delinquents or in Vice Squad, or witnessing, some of their colleagues apparently in the books like really do descend into racism when policing minority neighborhoods, and witnessing alcoholism and divorce and suicide, and being called to these sort of traumatizing child abuse cases and violent robberies. And it essentially, I guess, culminated in these three different sort of rookie police officers converging on the same real life Watts riots, which was something that Wambaugh himself had experienced firsthand. And so the book seems just like a little bit more sprawling and a little bit more dedicated to not any individual character. Actually, each rookie who we do see in this film was given their own section, their own veteran that they dealt with. And so when clearly it was being asked to be adapted, they said, okay, well, we want the rookie cop, veteran cop, we want you to focus on these two guys. You can keep the other characters, and they are, but they are really kind of relegated to a couple of specific episodes, whereas here they really do lean into the relationship between Stacy Keach's character Roy Fell and George C. Scott as Kilvinsky, who, you know, are essentially, one is a sort of married law student with a kid trying to pay some bills, and he gets paired with this veteran to show him the ropes. And Keach had just done Fat City, which is sort of interesting to think about, and I'm assuming that's why he got this role. He's fantastic in that film, and obviously George C. Scott was already a legend. He was the selling point of the movie. He was like Doctor Strangelove, you know, come on down, come check him out. I mean, later on too, we've talked about like Hardcore, The Changeling, Exorcist 3. This dude, if you had him in the role of like an old man chasing someone down in the streets, or as some sort of detective, whether it's in The Changeling where he's, I guess, a musician who kind of turns into a detective, or Exorcist 3 where he's literally a detective, he is fantastic. And every single ride along sequence with him in this, I really did take to his specific performance, because he's unlike any other cop I think that you would ever see in this role, because you kind of spend the whole movie waiting for the twist that he is like an absolutely unrepentant racist or something, or I don't know, you feel like you're waiting for him to reveal that he's like a horrible person or something, but he is a guy who's like just trying to, you know, he's kind of a realist about the job. He's like, there's certain things that I disagree with that I have to do, and there's other things where I think the superiors are getting it wrong and I wish they'd give me more power. And he kind of drives him around and gives him all of his sort of philosophies and methodologies that he has cultivated literally as just like a coping mechanism to get through every night shift, where he reduces the amount of confrontations that he has. One of the funniest examples early on that I thought was just incredible, which it was so specific, I assumed it had to have been picked up from experience, was when they're like, okay, we know that these prostitutes working, you know, sort of at night here are going to at some point get in trouble, and it's going to bother us and we're going to have to deal with it. So instead they kind of quasi kidnap them, but then also turn their car into like a party bus where they give them drinks and are kind of try to treat them to like a good time and keep them distracted for the night, and then literally just drop them off like miles away so that they can't ever make any of the money they were trying to make that night. But at the end they kind of go, you know what, we love this old cop, we love this guy, isn't he fun?
And they like he listens to their stories and laughs with them and everything, and it's just a very humanizing moment. And I do also like, I think I read that they added more for George C. Scott's character compared to the book because of Scott's pull and just, I mean, unbelievable talent. But I also like his rules, like he's kind of a mix between survival and caring about some of the people that are on the streets. Like, one of the rules does show the violence that he's prepared for and prepared to do. Like when he says, when they pull out a knife, you pull out a gun. When they use their fists, you use your baton. So there is something that he's like, we are going to exercise our power in a way that we see as fit, you know, and that is,
I love the line, civil to everyone, courteous to nobody, is how he describes what his behavior is, and also treat everybody the same.
There's a mix between survival and care with his character that can kind of, you know, contradict one another sometimes, but there is a real humanity to his character that's trying to shine through.
Shades of Sean Connery in The Untouchables in some of that philosophy too. I am fascinated by George Scott even being in this movie. He is 2 years removed from winning Best Actor for Patton at this point. And I'm almost certain that he's in it because he made a movie called The Last Run in 1971. It's a really good kind of crime thriller with Robert Duvall. And John Huston was directing that movie and was removed off of it. And he was replaced by Richard Fleischer. And he likes that movie, Scott, quite a bit. And so he basically says to Richard Fleischer, who is already preparing to work on The New Centurions, what are you doing next? And he tells him, and you know, George C. Scott is not the star of The New Centurions. This is very much Stacy Keach's movie. In fact, he kind of exits the movie pretty dramatically about 2/3 of the way through. And I think he just wanted to work with Richard Fleischer again because he liked that experience so much. And like you said, Jamie, they kind of beefed up this part. They gave Kilvinsky more than just like this kind of guardian angel philosopher king role and made him a more kind of emotional central dynamic of the story, which I think works really well. I agree. Around having multiple rookies and, you know, Eric Estrada and Scott Wilson play the other two rookies who are framed in the book but have much smaller roles. And they're both wonderful. And it's interesting to see them, both of those actors, so young, but they don't have nearly as much to do. And the movie essentially is built around Keach and Scott and their dynamic, and then kind of what their dynamic sets up for Keach in the final act of the movie. And, you're talking about like arguably one of the great screen actors of all time in Scott, who could do light and dark, who could go so big, but he's actually not that big in this movie. He doesn't fall prey to the Scott thing where he just like yells through the final third of the movie. And I do love that, as somebody who loves the hospital and loves the changeling. I love to see him kind of lose his mind on screen, but he never really resorts to that in this movie. It's a much sadder, much quieter kind of resolution to his character that is a really, really interesting choice for him at this stage of his career.
Yeah, no, he really plays him as a much wearier, like he feels sort of like the Wambaugh analog as someone who has actually, been doing this work for, over a decade at this point, and he's shepherding in these rookies who are kind of excited a little bit about the work, right? Like they kind of come in with their, they have futures in mind, they have sort of, kids and marriages, and they have these things they're excited about. I mean, for the Stacy Keach character, he's just like, I'm just doing this temporarily until I can get through law school and I can be on the other side. And one of the first things they say is that they're, we're going to kick the sort of book smart lawyer fucking head of you, that what about probable cause? Like, no, we need to break you in, kind of deals the attitude he has. And then once he is, he kind of likes it. He doesn't want to leave. It's one of those things where he's sort of attracted to it, and he likes the sort of fun that George C. Scott is able to bring out of it, and that's where his charisma is so important, because it's one of those things where his rules are both something that are survival taxes, something that will help you be able to make it through your shifts and be able to survive in that field for as long as he has. But I was more fascinated by the ideas that it was also a bit of an infection. A movie I thought about a little bit watching this was To Live and Die in LA. Not because I think that they're particularly, that's an adrenaline junkie version of the same thing. But I think about the ending of that film all the time, because it's an example of a character who maybe wasn't like the protagonist, who watches what he does, and all he does is fuck up that whole movie and get himself absolutely annihilated. And he's like, that is the coolest guy ever. I want to be that guy. And you feel, I think, a similar attraction that Stacy Keach sees to George C. Scott here, when especially like how cool he is when he's driving those girls around. He's like, baby, I got more soul than control. And and everyone just has a great time with him. He's like, this is what cop work is. This is crazy. And I think you can argue that on some level, this is a very, again, sort of a convenient depiction of, he happened to not be on one of the nights where they have to beat up a prostitute or do something, so that's something that the movie does address. It's worth noting. Eventually he does get into like Vice Squad, and he has to be part of a crew who is like essentially beating up gay men for sport in a park. And it becomes a less fun movie for him. But the whole movie is a series of sort of episodic encounters that differ from that. Sometimes it's cool as hell. Sometimes he gets into a gunfight and he's like, this is the best job ever. I feel like a real man today. And then other times they come into a drunk mom and, putting cigarettes out on her newborn baby. And they are like, I want to kill myself. Like, that's sort of, you never know what two things they're getting called to on any given night.
And then expressing how he also wants to be violent towards the mother in that moment too. Like, that's a dark moment. And uses power to enact that. And then there's also a moment where there's kind of like a brief shootout and in a parking lot at night, and he shoots a guy as he's kind of like he was shooting at him, but then he runs away and he shoots at him and he hits him and he goes down, and he says something like over and over again, like, I'm not scared. And it feels almost like he's going through an adrenaline kind of moment.
Well, yeah, because there's a bit where his hand is shaking, and George C. Scott like, don't worry, that's natural. You're just scared. And he's like, I'm not scared. I'm fucking amped.
Yeah, like I'm amped up. Like, and that's scary too, because we also get introduced to his family life in the beginning, and it is very like caring. His wife, is they're trying to have a conversation with him. He does fall asleep because of how exhausted he is, but he's putting his daughter to bed. It does feel like he really cares about the people in his life. and hasn't probably had that kind of, I don't know if you want to call it excitement, but I guess
I do appreciate that this stuff is
but
more realistically written than I feel like a normal sort of like shrill wife kind of, you know, getting, you know, sort of nagging, which is what a lot of the role I think could have been for this, because I mean, Dorothy, who's his wife played by Jane Alexander in the film, she's initially, I think, quite supportive of his decision, even sort of excited to share in it, you know? His daughter is drawing this like super cop pictures of him in crayon and waiting up till midnight to see him, and she just also over the course of the movie happens to see what the work is doing to him, at first making him incredibly tired and just sort of missing time with the family, and they're on opposite hours, where there's one scene where he tries to come home and sleep, but she's got the plumber there, so he can't sleep, but at the same time she's like, we can't afford to bring him in at a different time, like if we try to hire him later it's double wages or whatever. And so it's one of those things where every single decision you could imagine the wife doing to be, you know, be like spitefully like, I'm gonna hire the plumber while you're trying to sleep, but it's not. She has a legitimate financial decision, and the arguments feel like a real marriage fights. And that, you know, I don't know if this is Wambaugh went through a couple marriages during his time, I don't know, but these did feel like really authentic, like arguing over house maintenance and his eating habits, and you know what it is that they plan on doing. This idea that when she married him, she was marrying a lawyer, and now she's married to a cop, and it's a very different lifestyle she didn't buy into, and how he kind of goes, well, you married me, and maybe I didn't want to be a lawyer, maybe I wanted to be a cop the whole time, like I don't know, like it's a interesting dynamic.
This is some of my favorite stuff in the movie. One thing, Wambaugh was only married once. He was married to the same person his entire life. They got married in the mid-50s. And so that he didn't get divorced, but you can feel what seems like a lot of his experience in the Keach character, insofar as the Keach character is a guy who clearly thinks when he gets on the force as a kind of like launch pad to a bigger career, that he is going to take a traditional path that I think a lot of police officers take, which is that's a very stable job with stable pay that you can then use to kind of work in your off hours to get into a more white collar profession. And he's attempting to become a police officer. In the case of Wambaugh, he obviously had great aspirations to be a writer and a novelist. And he did that. He was writing these novels. This novel he wrote while he was active on the force. And then I think his second novel in 70, he wrote while on a leave from the force, but he had not retired. He had not quit being a police officer while he was writing these first few books. And that very explicit dynamic between a partner who wants to be supportive, that you've been with since the 1950s, when the perception of what police work was just a little bit more respectable. I think the role of the police officer in like a suburban American world in the mid 50s is dramatically different than the late 60s, where there is a much more like kind of active dispute in the culture against police officers. And so what you can kind of feel is him almost like reckoning with that, both abroad, outside the home, and inside of his house, where his wife is kind of realizing the way that it is a corrosive force on their marriage, on his soul, on his own expectation of himself as a person in the world. And it's very, very sophisticated and very true to life. I mean, I say this, like I said, my dad, when I was growing up, worked 4 to 12s, which meant he worked from 4 p.m. to midnight most of the time. And he was an undercover cop who was on a very explicit task force. I just never saw him. You know, I would wake up in the morning and he would be asleep, and I would get home from school and he would be gone and off to work. And I would see him on the weekends, obviously, but his life was not dissimilar from what is portrayed in the movie, where it's like, it's hard to have an active relationship with another person, to be in a marriage, when you're not matched in that way. And so the movie taking great pains to both, I think you're right, Josh, not villainize Jane Alexander's character, but also try to show you that Stacy Keach's character's job is quite strange and quite alienating from anyone who is not a police officer. And so invariably when you meet cops, most of their friends are cops, because only they can kind of understand what that lifestyle is like. And I like that as a feature of this story. It does eventually unravel, and they do eventually break up because it's not sustainable, and because Keach's character has kind of lost himself inside of this work.
Yeah, he gets a little addicted to it at a certain point, where you're just like at it, like she really has a turning point, I think, during that pretty fantastic sudden scene during the sort of robbery where I love the detail that George C. Scott just drives by and he was like, seems something weird about that, you know, like there was no guy at the counter in there, and they're driving by it and they kind of go, do we turn around? Do we go check that out? And they're like, yeah, let's go check that out. And they're literally just sort of, it's filmed from this vantage point where they are entirely looking on the outside and they can see a guy, you know, stuffing the bills into a bag, and you know, they realize they've caught an act of robbery. And Keach's first instinct is to see this car in front of him across the street that looks like it's about to get caught in crossfire if they were to approach, and he sees 2 people in it and he's afraid for them. So he goes up and he says, guys, like, get out of here. And it turns out to be the robber's getaway car. And they just blast him with a shotgun within 2 seconds of him looking in there and, you know, trying to basically get them to get away. And that moment of him just flying across the sidewalk with a point blank shotgun directly into his gut. And, you know, obviously having the hospital scenes after, and, you know, it's confirming for the wife, obviously, how dangerous this work is. And, you know, also for George C. Scott to be so kind of casual about it, like, this is what it is. And also, I've already kind of got my claws into your husband. Like, he likes this stuff. Like, I'm sorry, this isn't going to be enough to dissuade him out of this experience, which is such like a heartbreaking moment for the Jane Alexander character when she's like, look at him. Like, he probably should have died right then and there.
And there is like a really there's a darkness to it, because we realize later on in the movie how just alone George C. Scott's character is, and how like, he has no attachments, no love in his life, nothing. And then but
see, that's something the movie structurally is very clever with, to make you like the early stuff is hangout. He's friends with the cops. People like driving around with him. Like, he doesn't seem like a lonely guy at all. It's really when he retires, the moment that it feels like he's taught all these guys everything he needs to know, that those details start getting layered in, and you go, oh, these guys don't realize that, as I think Sean just, you know, very pointedly, you know, remarked upon it, but like, their friends are the people who they're on the job with, and they do not, they have no connection to the outside world outside of that. So the idea of leaving it behind is, he goes, I literally have nothing. And it's part of the lesson for the Stacy Keach character is that, oh shit, like, this work will literally alienate you in a way that, and you won't even notice. Like, it's such a gradual thing.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that is why that, like, I don't know if we're jumping too ahead, but we go all over the place on the show all the time.
No, jump around, go crazy.
So but his final phone call, really, that's what it is. George C.
It's one of the best scenes in the movie.
Yeah, it really is. And I think this was one of the things that was added for his character, so that his character kind of had a more, I guess, rounded ending and everything. But him reaching out to him and just asking to, like, have lunch, and that
story, you know, he tells is haunting. Where he's you know, I don't remember the exact details of it, but the idea of like getting called to this guy's house who he felt was just a crazy man, who thought that there was a guy sitting on his porch or something like that. And he was just like, this guy would come, and I would do my due diligence, and I would say, okay, I've checked, and there's, you know, he would see that there's no one there, and he'd go and tell him that, oh, he ran out the back door or whatever. Like, I got rid of this guy for you. And by the end of that story, he's kind of like, you know, I don't know. There's a point to this story.
Yeah, and I don't know what it is, but I think it is, again, I think that's the same thing with him. He's almost wrestling even with the thought of the phone call that he's having at that point too, where he's like, there's a point to this. I'm not sure what it is. We as an audience, I think, are just like, you're reaching out, man. You clearly want some type of companionship in any way, shape, or form, and you haven't been able to find it outside of the work.
Well, you see it on George C. Scott's face, and the way he uses his eyes the day he retires. Like, he's like, I don't want to leave this place. Like,
mandatory retirement, which is an important aspect of it. You know, he's not willingly doing this. He is being forced out of the force because of the structure of that police department at that time. And he has nothing else to turn to. He actually, you know, it's never clear how true or not true the reality of his life is in Florida. You know, whether he actually is with grandchildren or sees them. He talks about that with the other police officers when he comes back to visit. But is that it's hard to believe that a person would not be happy in that environment at the end of their, you know, life in retirement. But also when you've been conditioned to just be in the action, you know, we make light of this stuff in like really cool Michael Mann movies, but there's just like a real sadness to this work. And I think a lot of police officers are exposed to just a real ugly side of life. And the movie goes out of its way to indicate both that some of those things are out of their control, like the mother who is, you know, dropping her baby and burning cigarettes right next to her baby. but then also accidentally shooting men in cold blood. You know, like when the shop owner whose shop is robbed is killed in a dark alley, which is just some of the most
horrible moment,
horrifying, reckless, and dangerous action that a police officer can enact upon a person, just killing someone, an innocent person, out of carelessness. And so it's not just a whitewashed, like, these are sad men and they deserve your empathy. It is like, these are also dangerous guys who, if they're not trained properly, can really fuck up society and take people's lives away. So it's really unusual in that way that it really plays both sides of that.
Yeah, I agree. And I part of what got me a little twisted about the movie while I was watching it was two very different scenes that involve the two rookies we really haven't talked about yet, which is one is Gus, played by Scott Wilson, who I think is great in this film. And I loved him in Cold Blood, and which makes him, I think, perfect for this. But we've also talked about him in Ninth Configuration, Exorcist 3 as well. I guess George C. Scott and him collaborated a couple times, but he gets paired with this guy named Whitey, played by Clifton James, who was from like Cool Hand Luke and The Last Detail and stuff. And they answer a domestic dispute where they divorce the couple. Like, it's like this reverse impromptu wedding, which is like more of a silly moment. And then he obviously answers this armed burglary call where he accidentally shoots a black store owner with a gun he believes to be the robber, only to realize that he was the father of the son who literally called him and was in the process of chasing a robber with a gun. And, you know, the son is screaming at him that he's a pig. And the scene I found very revealing was Whitey trying to reassure him that you had no choice and I would have done the same thing. And it doesn't make him feel any better to hear that information. And that's one of the moments where you go, you know, they are showing this work as ugly and reckless, and they're being critical of it. And then they have a sort of a later scene with Sergio, played by Eric Estrada of Chips, who is the sort of Hispanic cop from East LA, who gets paired with Ed Lauder for very briefly from Longest Yard. And he ends up patrolling his own community, which is something that makes him a little uncomfortable. And I would have liked to have seen more of. I guess in the book, there's a lot more of his story, and kind of this. It's where sort of the racist element of the book kind of came in, which the movie does kind of go over a little bit. They kind of, you know, they don't include a lot of his story into it, but they do include one really important scene, which is where he, when Stacy Keach is hospitalized, the Sergio character is paired with George C. Scott, and at the behest of this sort of like angry white slumlord, essentially, they look into this sort of illegal immigrant house where he is clearly extorting all of these poor guys into paying him a ridiculous amount of money for a 1-bedroom shithole, essentially. And they don't know that when they go in. They're going in on the false basis of this guy accusing them of having a gun, accusing them of not paying their rent, and basically willing to shoot him to not pay their rent. And so they go in there prepared to be in a more dangerous situation. And when you go in there, they're like, oh, these guys are only a few days behind on their rent because they had to change jobs. And this guy is making them pay $300 a month for something that clearly is not worth that. So George C. Scott's Kilvinsky comes out and vengefully beats the shit out of this landlord and literally gives like a pro-immigrant speech about how, you know, the hard work that they do and the labor, you know, they're doing the labors that others won't do. And this was where I got a little crossed with the movie, because I went, you know, it's one thing to, I think, sort of lean away from the sort of like not depicting the more sort of institutional racism of the work. Obviously, it's another element to even put like, you know, it might have been a progressive attitude that Wambaugh himself had, and that's why he wanted to put it into the cop. Like, that very well might be true. It's just one of those things where doing one thing and then, you know, in conjunction with each other, I was like, oh, this cop is like, this is maybe the only heroic moment. It's still an ugly moment. He's beating the shit out of a guy, but it's maybe the one moment in the film where you're like, yeah, beat the shit out of that guy. And it's something that's difficult to imagine an LA cop even like doing today, let alone in 1972, right?
I get what I totally get what you're saying. I guess it's built into George C. Scott already, so it's like believable through his character acting. And
they do make him again the more caring, more, you know, sort of, you know, cop in that way for sure. But that was one of the things where I started to get crossed between, you know, some of the more other 70s depictions of cops that you've seen on screen, and this one, which was trying really, really hard to, I think, every once in a while, like lean away from an element that might have made made it a thornier character and lean it into, maybe they felt it would have been harder to sympathize with him if they had made him, I don't know, more Popeye Doyle-y or something like that. But that was one of the things I was kind of thinking about watching this.
It's one of the reasons why I think the movie, which is flawed but is so fascinating, is that it is constantly forcing you to rethink what these guys are. So that sequence in particular is in part because Wambaugh was a beat cop in the barrio, as he described it in interviews. And in the interview is literally saying, I've always been incredibly fond and felt close to the Mexican American community in Los Angeles, and going out of his way to kind of what we would now kind of derisively describe as virtue signaling. Like, that character is sort of virtue signaling, like, hey, this is a country built on immigrants, and the idea that you would take advantage of these figures, they're no different from you or your relatives, and that's absurd. Right. It's a movie that also in its final act finds Stacy Keach having an interracial relationship, and that's also something that 10 years prior you never would have seen in a cop drama made by Hollywood. And so Wambaugh is like constantly presenting the dramatic ends of both spectrums inside of this world that we think of in a very closed way. And it's just an unusual dynamic, like dramatic friction that I really, really respond to, because he never lets you settle on good guy or bad guy. Like, that's not really what these movies are about in any meaningful way. It's kind of like, everyone's fucked up. Here's how these cops are fucked up. And I appreciate the sensibility. Now, I'm sure Silliphant and Fleischer added a lot to that. And the idea of having, Keach and Scott are really, really uniquely gifted actors. And you can argue this material is like below their pay grade a little bit. It's kind of amazing that they made this movie in some ways, but they bring a kind of depth and poetry to the lives of these ordinary guys that really elevates the movie.
Yeah. And speaking of that kind of, that contrast too, there's like the way the movie works is through a lot of it. Obviously it's centralized through Roy and his family, and then kind of what he's learning from Kilvinsky. But a lot of it is these just kind of these different scenes that layer on top of each other, of them dealing with certain people in the public, whether it be a domestic dispute, a domestic violence, drugs, whatever it is. And then it starts to feel almost like episodic that way. But what you realize is that a lot of it ends up being conversations and kind of just like talking people down and getting more information and things like that. But there's such a difference with how this movie opens as well, like that introduction montage they do of the training, which is nothing but physical violence. Like, it's either gun shooting or, strangling or whatever they're doing for their like grapples. And I found that to be just to speak a little bit about like what you were saying there, where it feels like there's two different worlds always that they're dealing with, where they see the humanity in people because they're right in front of them, but they are still trained to be very physical and kind of aware of the seemingly constant danger that they might be in.
Well, they literally describe the act of retiring as putting the pin back in the grenade. Like, it felt like 25 years of holding a grenade in your hand is sort of the metaphor that they have.
Right. Yeah. So it always feels like there's this, even within the training, they're almost trained to feel on edge, which I can't imagine is the best way to go about it. I understand that there would be a lot of danger in the job. It's just like, to view every person you interact with as a danger immediately is what I think often leads to these escalations. So yeah, it's cool that the structure of the movie kind of deals with that too.
And it's also existentially living with that too, which is like a huge consideration. I do. It's so funny. There's a very writerly scene in the film where they get the moment where you get to point at the screen Rick Dalton style and be like, it's the new Centurions. They said it's right there. But like that moment is very clearly what Wambaugh is sort of like building to here, which is that, again, even if there's, moments in here where you can feel like he's trying really, really hard to get you to sympathize with police work, even if you're someone who is like, I fucking hate these bastards, and it's one of those things where it's going to be an interesting watch for anyone who's coming into it with that. And he tries to meet those people halfway by being like, this is not glamorous, this is not heroic, this is incredibly ugly, these are really, flawed people. But I want to connect you to this kind of slow, cynical, almost existential feeling of what it's like to be someone who's doing it and be disillusioned and or be depressed about it. And as indicated sort of by the title of the film, to feel like they are this pointless, quote unquote, sort of peacekeeper watching a world kind of crumble around them. And Sean used the term sort of like self-pitying. That's kind of the register it operates in, like that idea does anyway, like especially when they get in there and you have George C. Scott just being like, you know, the Romans had the centurions, and Stacy Keach is talking and telling it to him, but the reaction on his face when he's just like, you know, they were unsupported, they were unhonored, they were disliked, you know, but they held that line until they were overrun by barbarians, which is the detail where they go, damn. Well, if that doesn't sort of feel like today, but yeah, it's one of those things where, like, you know, I think the self-pitying could rub you the wrong way, especially if you feel like you're being, you know, propagandized is maybe the term someone would use. But I do think that it's just so skillfully made and it's so well acted.
Yeah, I never felt that way.
And it has enough like just really authentic, realistic detail that I did find myself being worked over by it, which maybe makes it even worse for some people. They go, it's effective propaganda.
I think you've got to consider like what the relationship was to police and police work in 1970 versus in 2020, for example. Like we're talking literally 50 years of police culture shifting over time. And there were certainly things happening in 1970 that were deplorable and are not even nearly properly portrayed in this movie. That
was when I rewatched Serpico a few years ago. That was one of the first times in a while where I was like, damn, they got really mad about all this stuff and it's only worse.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to keep that in mind, I think. But I think if you're trying to say, if you only look at the movie through a 2025 lens, the movie will fail you. You know what I mean? Like it's not, but it is a dramatically different experience. Even I live in Los Angeles. You know, I encounter the LAPD every day in my life. And that force is very different than it was 50 years ago. But the movie is certainly guilty of humanizing the cops, but it's coming from, I would say, a not sinister or political place. It is coming from I think a place of like a genuine humanity from a writer who is trying to sincerely communicate what his life has been like, what those around him, their lives have been like. And you could argue, well, you should never join the police force in the first place. And that's a convenient way to kind of hand wave someone's real life, but it is someone's real life. And so I'm just fascinated by the idea of him kind of consistently getting that. I mean, the next movie we'll talk about too, there are huge elements of this too in the second film where there are parts of this that are very ungenerous towards cops, and there are other ways in which the film goes out of its way to be tremendously sympathetic to cops.
Right.
And I find like when we're dealing with it's these individual beings within a system that has created certain power dynamics and certain rules that they have to follow, but even within that, they all have their own personalities. And I think like it's just kind of exploring that humanization of it. I think that there's nothing. I understand that it's like because they're so a part of a powerful system, it's hard to separate that and then just look at it through this like humanizing lens. But it feels for even having Kilvinsky having his own laws, like his own subjective laws within the power that he has within the system that he's working in, feels very. That feels like a very good way of kind of expressing how a human being would still find their individualism within the system and try to use it for good, even though it's still the way he says it is very complicated. And like I said earlier on, he's still saying like when they use a fist, you use a baton. So there are things that I would totally disagree and disavow there. But I just don't think the blanket statement of just like they're humanizing cops, therefore it's bad and it's propaganda is I think that's just very, very stupid.
No, it's definitely more intriguing that I felt that same way when we'll get into Onion Field as well. But it's like, even if I think you look at what Wambaugh's doing and you kind of disagree with like the project, you could say, of making cop life into this very sort of like weepy, sympathetic kind of thing. He grounds his stories in so much, as Sean is just putting it, I think great, which is like real experience. And it is valuable, I think, to see that that experience here. It's definitely unlike anything I've seen when talking about like there's so much embarrassing rawness to what it is that he's trying to convey to you, and clearly stuff that he's not proud of, and stuff that he is like, this is what happened, this is reality in a way, and it's trying to fit a fictional molds for you to watch, which is maybe one of the other parts where you might get a little cross-wired when you're just like, I have seen one of the most harrowing scenes of my life about a lonely, depressed cop killing himself, and then you're getting into Stacy Keach, who immediately is hitting that bottle and immediately is getting into crazy car chase sequences and stuff like that. And I will say, I think for me, all the stuff with George C. Scott was so good that when he left the movie, it does this really interesting thing of deliberately leaving a black hole in the movie you're supposed to feel, because it's like he was such a central figure to this guy and he's not in his life anymore. You're meant to feel that. But at the same time, I was like, they didn't save a lot left for the Stacy Keach character, and I think that was because they cut the other two guys out of it, and they didn't kind of come up with the, his book seemed like it had this really natural structure of the three guys then converging on a riot all together and stuff like that. And with this one, they were like, oh, we really prioritize Stacy Keach, so we need to give him a whole nother sort of element of this, and that's where they throw in this kind of interracial relationship he gets into with a nurse who treated his wounds, and it's meant to be sort of his comeback, his realization that the lessons he learned from Kilvinsky did not serve that man, and maybe there's time to cure himself of that mentality that he just had this guy teach him over the course of a year or whatever it was in the time of the film, which obviously, because this is a 70s movie, they go, well, no, you can find love, but also fuck you. Because it's just, I that was where the sort of the gears of like the 70s sort of like crime thriller movie that the producers were asking for me kind of dug their claws in, because they were like, Stacy Keach is going to get drunk, Stacy Keach is going to fall in love, he's going to get in a car chase, and then you're going to love him, and you're going to fucking kill him.
He's going to die.
And I was, and it was a lot to go through in like 20 minutes of a movie that felt a little bit more sort of graceful in, I think, some of the storytelling that it was doing prior to that, because, like, again, you can do incredibly depressing. The George C. Scott stuff is so thoughtful, and there's so much power to it. And it got to the ending of this one, and I was like, oh, I think they're trying to hit me again. And it didn't hit me as hard.
It really feels like it's a 2 hour and 10 minute movie that's been whittled down to 1 hour and 40 minutes in some ways, because you really don't kind of get to play out really any of the young characters. You don't really get to play out Estrada or Wilson's characters either, in terms of like what their arcs are in any meaningful way. And it's definitely a flaw of the movie, but I am just still kind of impressed by the vulnerability of all of the characters in the movie, and still think most of that stuff works so well. And honestly, the car chase, the kind of car hanging off the car finale that is like the dawning moment for him, fucking rocks. I mean, it's just
so sick.
It's so well done. And so, I mean, the stunt guy on that sequence is just remarkable, because he is pulling it off. I mean, it's cut together so beautifully, and obviously it's in a moment in Hollywood where there's about to be a lot of really good car chases. I guess it's right in the afterglow of Bullet and French Connection, but it works so well in terms of on-location LA shooting and the alleyway work, where like she's driving directly into boxes and you can see the stuntman slashing through the boxes and the white picket fence. Like it's such a good sequence.
Yeah, for anyone who is interested, there is a sequence that is identical to this sequence in a direct-to-video action film called Maniac Cop 2. And it's just so funny that it was the last thing I expected when I threw this movie on, to be like, I'm going to watch like a Larry Cohen, William Lustig sequence that's just going to pop out of nowhere.
I thought it was going to just turn into another thing where he's drunk, and he's kind of like, he's drunk on his power now, so he like takes advantage of the woman by giving her more money or doing something of a corrupt nature, and then for her to just speed off and he attaches himself to the side. That was the last thing I was expecting.
And also the fact that it's a good excuse in terms of screenwriting for him to go back to the nurse, even though she said she didn't want to, go out with him or anything like that. And also for this kind of self-punishment kind of component of the movie, I think, as well, because I mean, it seems like it was actually in both movies. There's another more overt sort of self-punishment aspect to the next one as well. So it's just like Wambaugh clearly had a couple things he really, really liked to kind of return to, and I do think this one is quite effective. Again, I have a couple sort of flaws with it as it kind of built to its I think it was partially because I'm so used to the 70s punching me in the gut that this one, for whatever reason, even though Keach I think is performing it beautifully and Wilson is there holding him, and it's a sad moment of him just dying in some really deliberately designed to be quite pathetic and low stakes altercation where they answer a domestic dispute on their way to fucking breakfast. And they just get shot by a random dude and he goes down. And I can see the kind of bleak poetry of that moment. It just, for whatever reason, I was just like, it went past that level of miserableism that I love to a level of miserableism where I was like, all right, guys, okay. And I don't know what it is. I can never figure out that line. It just happens when I'm watching a movie because people know I love the misery on this show. Every once in a while, someone goes really into it. I'm like, that's sick. You guys are disgusting.
That's great. Make me
You're
cry.
Great filmmakers. And then for whatever reason, I think it was maybe just because the George C. Scott one was still in my mind. I was watching this one and I was like, oh, of course. They're going to kill him too.
It does feel like the more impactful one I found myself.
Well, and also him just crying out like, I was just beginning to learn my lesson, God.
Yeah. Okay, that was
I was starting relationships again. I swear, spare me. So that was one of those moments where I was maybe it's laid on a little bit thick, but overall, I do think that this is still quite strong. And I think maybe if we are pivoting towards reductive rating round, this was a very, very solid to high 3 for me. And honestly, I feel like I've almost talked myself into liking it more than that as we've had this conversation. So I think I'm going to come back to this at some point as well and give this another go, because there's a lot here. There's a lot of value, and some of the things that I think was sort of my brain getting crossed was me having 2025 vision on a 1970s cop movie. And also, though, I think just not really knowing what Wambaugh's deal was. It took me a little while before I figured out. It really, watching Onion Field was where I went and I saw the similarities and I was like, this is clearly what this guy does. And I do have a lot of respect for this, for having this 15 or 20 years of experience in the LAPD that he had, and to be able to translate that to the screen in such raw, vivid ways for people, in ways that, again, I do think will trouble people, but I think in some ways designed to kind of trouble you a little bit. These guys live troubling lives. They live flawed lives. They live lives where they clearly, there is not good guys and bad guys, and they are, struggling to make sense of that and their place in it and what it does to every other facet of their life. And I do think that this, Wambaugh goes out of his way to be like, this is a ugly, unheroic, line of work that, even if people are young kids who feel excited about it and want to see it as heroic, it just sucks that out of them. And it really is a pretty tough and existential portrait, I think, of what the sociological idea of what a cop is in our society. Like, it's something it's worth looking at and it's worth thinking about, even if you, I think, disagree with Wambaugh's level of openly emotional connection to some of these guys, and you feel a little bit of the mechanical gears of that working on you. I think it's really effectively done, even if you feel those.
This is a personal thing for me, and it is a bit of a prism through which I view a lot of movies. But there are two different schools of thought, I think, kind of critically when engaging with movies. One is, what is the text? Like, sit me down, present the movie to me with no external information, and I will evaluate how I feel about it entirely based on what I've just witnessed. And then there is contextual analysis. I'm personally in the latter camp, where I like to know a lot about who's made a film or made a story, what roles they had in it. I love the production history of movies. I'm fascinated by the choices that are made. And the more you learn about Wambaugh and his experience, and the more you read about the people who, like, why he became a kind of micro phenomenon in Hollywood for a 10-year period, the more interesting these movies get to me. And the fact that he actually kind of went out of fashion at a certain time, and why that was the case, and kind of what cops on screen became in the Lethal Weapon 1980s is also really interesting. And the shaving off the nuance that he's attempting to build around this very weird job, and how actually kind of destructive in a different way those 80s movies became the Beverly Hills Cops and the Lethal Weapons, where it was sort of like, these guys are wisecracking heroes and they're your best friends. And like, also, don't worry about the terrible shit that they do because they're going to save the day. And these movies are a way better alternative to that, in my opinion, even though I enjoy Beverly Hills Cop and Lethal Weapon, and I think those movies are fun. If you're actually trying to have a serious thought about what this job is, these movies do a great job of that. And also, you know, Wambaugh died this year, and so I was just thinking about him a lot. And his movies upon rewatch, even though he's not even really the author of many of these movies, but the frameworks for all these stories are so atypical to Hollywood narrative. You know, the Onion Field is the same way. I mean, this is they're just not, they're barely even 3-act structure Hollywood style movies. They're these, like, as you guys have said, these kind of episodic character studies that shift perspective, that shift allegiance, that shift tones at times, and you kind of never really know when you're meant to be at the end of an arc in a story. They just kind of stop, which is, you could make the case as a flaw, but as somebody who has seen thousands of movies as you guys have, I find quite interesting and quite unusual. So I really like to just going back and watching both of these movies just for this conversation.
Yeah, no, I think I'm in the same boat. Right now it's a strong 3, but I feel I'll be going back to this because at first, honestly, the structure is kind of what I wasn't sure how to wrestle with, because it seemed like it wanted to focus on Roy and Kilvinsky, but then it would also go to the other two groups of cops. And I even when I didn't know anything about the novel or how that was structured, but I could just get this sense that this was probably how the novel was structured, and they were kind of playing with it or stretching it out or something like that. So I just like to retackle it knowing exactly what it is. But I do think the character work is very strong. I think Keach is good and Scott is great. I love, again, I think for me, it's funny too, because I guess this is an added scene for the movie and not related to the novel, but that scene with Scott at the end with him reaching out for like kind of one last human connection. I find myself thinking about since I've watched the movie, and him mirroring the kind of lingering man in his story himself when he's trying to tell him that, I think is just so heartbreaking. And also I think the direction is great in that, and Fleischer's great in general, but the focus on Scott in that scene, he never strays away from Scott's character. He doesn't cut back and forth between Keach and him having the conversation. You don't see Keach at all. In fact, I don't even think you hear his voice. So it is just kind of like just lingering and focused hyper on Scott and his pain and his kind of need for human connection. So I think it's fantastic. And also Fleischer doing this suspense building into the first shotgun shot that happens to Keach's character, Roy.
Yeah, it's great.
Is really good. And then having that scene be, you know, it's kind of, it directs you as an audience really well, where it's kind of like you feel the suspense, and then he gets the big gut punch. And then with the final scene when he actually dies and gets shot again, that he kind of does this more casual crane shot that feels like this is just going to be another encounter, not going to be anything massive, and then he's killed. And I think that those decisions are fantastic, and Fleischer does a bunch of great stuff throughout this. And yeah, I think the humanizing to me is fine. For me, it's the overly sentimental stuff that makes it just a little much at times.
We'll talk about that a little bit more in Onion Field.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, no.
Because I think I had less of an issue with it in this movie after I watched Onion Field, and I went, no, actually, that was pretty subtle. Actually,
yeah, for sure.
Centurions.
Yeah, I would argue that is the difference between the two directors in these two films too, in terms of
that
how they actors and characterization.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, strong 3 for now, but I'll be going back to this. I really did enjoy it.
Yeah, and yeah, Fleischer is just fantastic. The fact that he's able to do the naturalistic, like observational thing, kind of expected of him, and then when it's like, okay, we need you to do this stylized dramatic moment, or we need you to, you know, do this 70s action beat for us, and he was on hand just to do all of it, and yeah, somehow make like a movie that's like grimy and grubby and downbeat, but also sensitive and kind of meandering in an interesting way. And yeah, it's definitely worth taking a look at. But that's going to wrap it up, I think, for New Centurions here. We're going to be right back, and we're going to be talking about The Onion Field, and you'll want to stick around especially if you like a slimy James Woods, which a lot of listeners of the show, I think, do.
The screenplay is by the author.
We have now seen what the Onion Field looked like on the night of March 9th.
What happened in the Onion Field is true, but the real crime is what happened after. Joseph Wambaugh's The Onion Field. A true story. Coming from Avco Embassy Pictures.
All right, we are back, and we are talking The Onion Field, the 1979 crime drama directed by Harold Becker, this time written by Joseph Wambaugh himself, who was adapting his own 1973 nonfiction true crime novel, and starring John Savage as an LAPD detective whose partner is kidnapped and killed by a very violent criminal played, or at least led by, there's two criminals, but led by James Woods. And the two kind of get locked in what is kind of stated as like a bit of like a courtroom battle. And I guess that's technically true, but it's not like it turns into like a courtroom drama. It's just more of another sort of soul-sucking Wambaugh thing of the courts are really horrible and bad, and cops dealing with post-traumatic stress is a pretty bleak existence. The cast also includes, by the way, Franklin Seals, Ted Danson, Ronnie Cox, and a surprise out of nowhere Christopher Lloyd, who has a bizarre appearance in the movie I can't wait to talk about. But this is our first time on the show talking about Harold Becker, a New York stills photographer turned commercial director turned feature filmmaker who made his debut film with a crime drama called The Ragman's Daughter in 1972, and then did not make another film until he got this job in 1979. So I have no idea what happened there, but I'd be very curious to learn more about that. And I guess it was liked enough to get him a career, at least this film was, making various crime thrillers. I know that he did another Wambaugh adaptation one year after this one because Wambaugh liked working with him so much. And he eventually went on to do Sea of Love with Al Pacino, Malice with Alec Baldwin and Nicole Kidman. But the only movie I've personally seen prior to this one is, weirdly enough, his military school drama Taps, which I watched as part of my personal Tom Cruise retrospective that I was doing. I wanted, maybe it was pre or post Maverick, I can't remember, but I was like, I'm going to go through all these. What are these Tom Cruise movies I have not watched? And that was one of the ones that I watched because it was one of his bigger sort of like pre-risky business kid roles where he was, with Timothy Hutton's in it, Sean Penn, Giancarlo Esposito. George C. Scott is their drill instructor general, speaking of the connection there. And personally, I'll confess, I thought that film was a little long and a little dry and a little sentimental for my taste. But Sean, what is your experience with Harold Becker? Do you have any really out there Harold Becker thoughts?
I think I've seen every movie he's ever directed except for The Ragman's Daughter. So I think
So you're a Becker scholar.
I wouldn't say that. I mean, I was coming of age at a time when Sea of Love, Malice, and City Hall, the great flawed City Hall starring Al Pacino and John Cusack, which was a kind of like mid-90s post David Dinkins portrayal of the mayoral role in the city and like what
that's one of my watch list for a while because it's like a Nicholas Pileggi like co-wrote it and Paul Schrader co-wrote it or something.
Yeah, so I think it's more Nick Pileggi than Paul Schrader ultimately, but Nick Pileggi, his one of his nephews lived across the street from me when I was growing up. And so like when Goodfellas came out, it was like a celebration in my neighborhood. New York people who knew somebody who had a part in the greatest movie ever made, or at least it felt to us like that at that time. So anyway, Becker was just like a steady hand, I would say. I think he kind of rises and falls to the material, and he kind of tends to let his actors take over his movies a little bit, and sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes it's not such a good thing. City Hall is one of the first times when it really felt like Al Pacino had kind of lost the plot in terms of how big he was willing to go. And this is kind of like Right in the Scent of a Woman, Devil's Advocate, where like bigger is better for him. He also made like what I think is a pretty mediocre sports drama called Vision Quest about wrestling, starring Matthew Modine and Lindy Fiorentino. I've never seen The Boost, which is a Sean Young, James Woods drama from 1989, which I'm going to watch now since I've been thinking about Becker a little bit. So that's maybe my one blind spot with him. But the story is super interesting. I learned this reading an interview with Wambaugh, that he controlled the rights to the production of The Onion Field. So he raised the money and sought out the filmmaker. And so he saw The Ragman's Daughter. And because he saw that movie, which was not very well seen in Victoria Tennant, I think her first movie, he hired him. He effectively, because he controlled the movie, he hired Becker to do this. And then they obviously formed this bond. And he felt like he really understood the material. So, Becker is It's an interesting dude. Not a great filmmaker, but an interesting one.
It's got to be really interesting to be like, you make one film and it doesn't do much for you, and then all of a sudden just like one of the most popular best-selling, sort of cop movie novelists is like hand picks you because he was the one person who saw the movie.
Yeah,
that's a very interesting way for this to have happened, and also for Wambaugh fever to just go as crazy as it did throughout the 70s. I mean, they did The Night, they did the Choir Boys, and apparently that was why he wrote this. He did not like or maybe it was the Choir. I can't remember which one he didn't. One of those two films he really hated, and he thought the writer ruined it. So that was why for this one, this is his first time adapting his own novel, and why I think he would adapt almost the rest of them after this even. And he was given like, I'm taking control of what my writing looks like on the screen, and I'm writing it myself. And that is where, for me, even structurally, I could tell that, New Centurions was made by people who were normally working on kind of normal movies. And this one has a structure which is, again, really cool and really unique. It's kind of like a two-part structure to it. I guess we can't say it's completely unheard of. I will say I'll make one big comparison, which for me was In Cold Blood, which I thought about a lot while watching this movie in ways that was like, I'm happy to be reminded of In Cold Blood. It's one of the best books and one of my favorite movies. But at the same time, it was not a particularly forgiving comparison at times, because not everything can be In Cold Blood, unfortunately. And this was one of the cases where it has a very similar structure, where it's like the first half is almost like this quasi slice of life, like you're kind of hanging out with these people, and there's a fatalism to the idea of, you kind of know that something's going to go wrong, these two things are going to collide, and senseless violence is about to ensue. And then the actual sequence itself is completely harrowing, and I think honestly quite well handled by Becker when we get into some of the specifics of it. And the second half, and it's a very similar structure for In Cold Blood, where they just have you tag along with these kids who are about to do this horrendous thing. You watch them do it. You watch it in harrowing procedural detail of them doing it, and then you get a second half, which is the sort of institutional critique, which is here is how we have built the world to process this. And in Cold Blood, it's a hugely troubling thing to him that, when we see something like this that doesn't make sense to us, like how could a human being make a decision to do this to somebody else? We haven't built a system that has figured out how to handle that and make sense of it. And like in a logistical way, there's an effort made, but when you get to the second half of that movie and you watch these guys go on death row, and you get to in the book as well, you're like, these are two kids who have committed literally the worst thing I've ever seen that I can't wrap my head around. And the idea of watching those two kids get like hanged is something, it doesn't make you feel good, or like something's been solved here, anything's been handled properly. And so I think that there was something, this movie feels like it sets a similar sort of situation up. And when he gets into his second half, he really just kind of goes, I'm going full on, almost as conveniently broad in the drama of like, these guys are gonna loophole this system like you've never seen. It feels like he's airing his dirty laundry about like lawyers and judges. Wambaugh, lawyers and judges, it's on site. He doesn't like these guys. And then you get into sort of the PTSD element of the film too, which is maybe, if you had any trouble with the New Centurions and how they really try to get you to sympathize with a cop character, this is like, to a degree that was even further than I kind of expected of the movie. And it makes sense with the real life story. I can see why Wambaugh was attracted to writing about this story. And it is a fascinating thing, which we'll get into the details of.
Yeah, I think that this is a unique one to try to criticize the sentimentality in any direction because it is a true story, and the events in the movie transpired while Wambaugh was on the force. So, for example, the Hettinger character who gets this very almost like soft focused portrayal of his trauma in the aftermath of this event in the final 45 minutes of the movie is, I would say, some of the worst stuff in the film, but also feels kind of incontrovertibly true. And that's a unique thing with real life drama, the attempt to kind of dramatize something that actually happened, especially when you're like the writer of the story knew these people. They obviously are inherently empathetic to their experience, but the way that Hettinger is talked about in the second half of the film by his former colleagues is so fascinating, and I think reveals some of that conflicted dynamic that Wambaugh feels about being a police officer. You know, that there are just a lot of guys who do this work who are just unforgiving motherfuckers. And then there are also all these other people who do this job that are really sensitive people and can be damaged pretty significantly by what they experience in the job. And some people put up walls and some people can't. And that stuff to me works really well. The legal proceedings and the how we come to better understand the Jimmy and Greg characters, I still find really confusing. And it's interesting to talk about, but I feel like you can feel the plot slipping through Becker's fingers in the second half of the movie, where he's like, what is this movie about? And then it kind of circles back all the way at the end to the Ted Danson character and his origins. And we've kind of forgotten that a cop died by the end of the movie. And then they sort of like forcibly remind you with this extremely maudlin conclusion. And yet, I still think this is a super interesting movie. And it features great performances. I like it with many reservations and think it is a really unusual adaptation of true events.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think it's one of those things where I think you're spot on that he's so true to his own material, which is obviously true to life. He feels like he's doing reporting on this situation. And it's one of those things where it's interesting because you're like, well, on some level, then you kind of have to be like, this is something that really took place and he's doing a lot of effort to not fictionalize and heighten it in any kind of way that, you know, you would expect the producers of the New Centurions were like, throw a car chase in or something, you know, like he doesn't cave to that. But at the same time, I think you watch these two movies in succession with each other and you see what it is that like an adapter like Silliphant, you know, does to a book. And he's like, you know, your book is great, but I'm going to focus on these two characters and I'm going to, you know, expand the George C. Scott character this way and do this because it works better as a movie. And I think that is maybe a little bit of what Wambaugh was, you know, didn't have as much sort of knowledge about how to do. But at the same time, it is very rawly him. And I will say I was really invested. Every issue I kind of had with it kind of cropped up more in the second half. I don't think I had a problem with anything in the first half of this movie when you are just getting to learn about sort of Carl, played by John Savage, and Ian, played by obviously pre-Cheers Ted Danson here, ripping the bagpipes in this film, which becomes a very important character detail that he's Scottish. And they're sort of newly formed partners in sort of the felony squad. And Carl is kind of this sort of tough-talking kind of farm boy who likes drinking and poker, but is kind of revealed to maybe be not quite as macho as he pretends to be when he gets into an actual situation. And then Ian is kind of the more sensitive and kind of intellectually minded of the two. I mean, he talks about how he wanted to be a doctor. He obviously plays this instrument. And also sort of intriguingly is the bigger of the two men, which becomes a really important detail to the film, and that these guys are sort of having a bit of a masculine contest is a big part of what ends up sort of happening to sort of trigger the crime of this film. But essentially, we're introduced to these two guys, and then in parallel to them, we're introduced to Jimmy Youngblood Smith, played by Franklin Seals, who is an actor who I don't know that I've seen much outside of Southern Comfort, but I really like him in Southern Comfort, and I really like him in this film, even though I think there's others who will watch it and will feel like he's maybe doing a little too much. He's very wide-eyed, he's very screamy, he's very but in a way I found quite strange. Like I don't think another actor would have made some of the decisions that he made, and I think it's also hard when your screen partner is fucking James Woods.
I think James Woods would actually bring that out of anybody. So
I think he would too. I think if I was standing in a room with James Woods, I would start getting a little more maniacal or something. You know, like in this movie, is incredible. He obviously he ended up getting a Golden Globe nomination for this. It was kind of the one thing that stood out about the movie to everybody was that everyone loved the James Woods performance in it as this character Greg Powell, who essentially offers Jimmy, who's recently out on parole, sort of partnership in making real money, Jimbo, which he means just sort of robbing liquor stores. And he's the way that Woods plays it, he's just so kind of smiley and giggly and sort of amicable. And then on a dime, he's just like unhinged and shouty and waving a gun in the air. And you know, he treats him in a way that he's letting you in on his scheme. And you know, he has a lot of ideas about how a scheme works, and he has a lot of funny outfits he puts on and disguises. A very interesting character. And then he also will just get really annoyed at you very quickly. And he frightens Greg a lot throughout the film, who ends up being sort of deferential to him because he seems sort of friendly and welcoming, but he also, he has it feels like that character, that demeanor is like just barely disguising some menace and sadism. There's something deep down in there.
He has this overconfidence about him, and you could definitely argue a charisma that is introduced right away. Even the way he's shot is like, I think at the time Jimmy is kind of a little bit lower, but he might be helping out his old buddy with the shoes shining that he's doing. And then so the camera kind of pans up to James Woods, and he's got he's skinnier than he usually is. Like you said, he's got the gold tooth, and he has this charisma that's snaky. Like you do kind of see this, there's like a car salesman thing kind of about him. And I love there's these little gestures that he does right away with Jimmy, where he's like, let's go get a job for you or whatever. And then when he does it, he kind of pokes him in his side, but he pokes him in his side with a gesture of a gun and then triggers it a couple times. Jimmy can't see it, but it's there in the camera. And I just was like, right away, something is just, he's hiding, he's going to be sneaky, he's going to be violent, but it's all going to kind of erupt.
If you're a James Woods fan, you will have to watch this movie just for the performance, just to see him say things like "I'm a sexual virtuoso," or doing the little bit where he's like "kissy kissy," to his girlfriend as she's getting out of the car. There's some incredible James Woods, just like pure acting in this.
Definitely, and I also like the beginning too, where it has this very happy, sunny, beautiful neighborhood pan shot that's going on. And then it goes to the jail where the new guy is meeting Ted Danson's Ian Campbell, and he's playing the bagpipes, and it's kind of funny and everything, but it seems to do a much light-hearted version of they are able to be louder and kind of express themselves in a different way within this environment than they are at home, because he even mentions that he can't play the bagpipes at home because it's too loud and it's too abrasive and whatever. And it just seems to kind of in a much lighter way be related to how Stacy Keach's character kind of transforms while on the job and on the streets compared to when he goes back to his suburban house. So yeah, I thought that all these introductions were really great, and of course well performed. I mean, every character actor here is just killing it.
Yeah, I feel like this is Ted Danson's first movie part, and
oh wow,
which is fascinating to think about, given that he looks like a fully formed star, even in this movie. And there's just like New Centurions, there's a level of specificity in the characterization that is just feels born of real experience, and it does not feel like a guy sitting alone in a room trying to invent a world. It's like a person who had been proximate to a world and is literally ripping some of those experiences out and putting them in to this story. And so it really helps to have the electrified fence that is James Woods, really in any movie. I mean, and he gets to do kind of both sides of his screen persona in this movie. He gets to do the seedy, slimy guy, and then he also gets to do in the final act the erudite kind of master manipulator thing that he does so well, like in Casino. And I mean, he just pops off the screen so hard in every movie that he's ever been in. And it's interesting to watch him really lock down the persona specifically in this movie. He has parts of it in Night Moves, but it's such a small part. And he was in a couple of other movies. But this feels like the first time that he got to take like a huge bite out of a screenplay and put his impression all over it. And
you can trace the line from this film to Videodrome to like what he does for James for Harris in Cop, which is like one of our favorite movies. Yeah. Speaking of cop movies, but that's maybe the ugliest cop movie I've ever watched. And James Woods is a huge part of that.
And even like Digstown and The Getaway and all these movies that he's in where he's kind of toggling between both sides of that, and it comes in such amazingly stark contrast to Savage's acting style, which is reserved, interior, quiet, occasionally overdrawn, I would say, like a little bit like trying to reach for an emotion that maybe he can't totally capture. But they feel like two completely different performance styles, and so they feel like two completely different worlds, and the movie kind of toggles neatly between those two worlds in the second half of it in a way that I really like.
Yeah. Like one of my favorite moments from Woods in just kind of his like overconfidence and but still to a silly degree almost is when they're talking about going on the robbery, and he mentions that he put on makeup, specifically like bushier eyebrows and slightly thinner lips or something like that.
He put a mole on his ear.
Put a mole on his ear so the witnesses will describe him differently. But I just found it funny because he's so proud of it, and he's the only one that's done it. But there isn't a lot of detail in the makeup, so it does still look exactly like James Woods. But I just love his character's incredible confidence in it.
It's a fantastic detail because he's rocking the like noir trench coat and everything too, and he clearly wants Billy, the guy, to go in for him, but he won't, because he says he knows the guy because they're part of the community. So he goes in and does the robbery himself, and it's one of those things where he's annoyed the whole time that he's working with like amateurs. He's like, this is how it's done, but his ideas are so silly in terms of like what his schemes are and how he's like, I'm not going to match any coherent descriptions if anyone finds us. And there's a later one that they do it. This is a great detail. I'm glad you brought it up, because it results in the crime, or in the actual situation that goes down, because they end up wearing like these sort of like leather outfits and like these hats when they're driving in the car. And he goes, we're going to look so strange that no one is, we're not going to look like this when we're driving Getaway. But before they do the crime, they look suspicious to Carl and Ian, who are just on patrol, and they're like, who the fuck are these weird guys in the weird outfits in their car? And it literally is what draws them to pull them over, to which James Woods responds by pulling his gun on them and disarming him, and then making Jimmy disarm John Savage and loading them into their car and driving them out into the onion field in a way that for me kind of recalled Ida Lupino's like The Hitchhiker, which is just like 70 straight minutes of just like sweaty, intensely riding around with guys at gunpoint, and everyone just kind of waiting for the explosive violence of these men to kind of rear its head. And in that film specifically, it's very much to do with the idea of like the gun as power, the gun as being a man. And I was surprised to see that almost partially come up in this film as well, with Woods at first kind of doing the friendly thing where he's promising to drive them only far enough away to ensure that it's a long walk, and he's going to leave their guns in the bushes so they don't have to, pay for them out of their own pocket, which is a detail that you feel like no other writer would put in the movie other than Wambaugh, that the cops would have to, it would be annoying to have to pay for their guns that they lost. But the look on Ted Danson's face, and this is another movie I feel like when he exits the movie in a way that he obviously has to, but he exits the movie, and I was like, it was a little bit of a loss. I thought he was doing one of the more interesting performances of anyone in the movie. And because he sees through that false friendliness in a way that the John Savage character does not. And he picks up on Woods' vibe, and you can tell that like Woods can tell, and he sort of challenges him to these weird sort of macho contests, like, how big are you? Like, what war did you serve in? And how are you with your pistol? And every time you can see Ted Danson, who's like, he's responding in a self-deprecating, like, well, not very. I'm honest. I'm shit. I'm a shit shot. I'm not that tall, to be honest. And he's trying to diffuse the situation, and it doesn't matter because Woods has already in his mind decided that he is going to execute this man. And we, find out through details again that feel very specific to Wambaugh. He shouts about something called the Lindbergh Law, which we'll get into the details of, but it's this idea, I think, if you kidnap someone violently for ransom, it's considered a capital punishment in California. And it's something that this character had in his head, that by kidnapping these cops, they were already, it's always like that heat moment when they're be like, well, we've already gone all the way. We might as well kill the guy and not leave a witness. That's kind of his mode that he thinks about. But you don't know that while you're watching that sequence take place. And it just is I think a fantastically tense and dark and shadowy, and the sweat and the way that they hear the bagpipes and the slow-mo shot of the bullet like going through his upper lip, which is such a specific detail that, again, you feel like a normal movie would be like, just shoot him in the heart or something, or I don't know. But it's, there is some true to life strangeness to the way that this crime is done that feels real and scary because it's real.
Yeah, and that direction I think is important too, because of just the emphasis of that specific moment when the violence takes place, because that's the one thing I think that the whole PTSD flashbacks that happen in the second half actually do well, when it's a little bit more visceral and there's more like sound design surrounding it. When he's just kind of doing something casual, the John Savage character, Carl, and they do these like major flashes of that exact shot of him being shot in the middle upper lip and the blood splatter and all of that. I think those are quite effective. Again, it is too elongated as it goes on, but I think it's so important that he directed this moment that way, so that when he repeats it, it just kind of keeps hitting that kind of visceral feeling. And also, I think at the very beginning too, I think it's kind of important where he makes the decision to give him the gun, where the guy has the James Woods' character Greg has the gun to his back, and he's just like, look, there's nothing that we can do. And John Savage's character wants to fight back, but he's just like, look, I think I know better in this situation. I'm the senior officer here. Let's just let this happen, and we'll hopefully figure it out along the way.
Yeah, that is important details. Part of what Sean was mentioning was that the cops, there is a sort of critique of the way that cops even treat him after the fact, right? And the idea that he was a coward, and he should have gotten into like a macho shootout with those guys, and this should have never happened in the first place, right? That's a huge kind of component of the second half of the movie.
Yeah, the chief comes in and says that, and just kind of like shames all of them, not just well. And it's interesting too, he's even kind of a coward the way he does it, because he doesn't outright say that cop, specifically Ian Campbell, he is a coward for doing what he did and instructing his partner to give away the guns. He just says it in a general way and says it to all of the cops to shame like the entire force into it. And then it like,
well, because he doesn't want an embarrassment for his department in the future. Like this is, I think, what's on his mind.
Any cop who gives his gun to a punk is a coward, is I believe.
Right,
exactly.
Which is just unbelievable too, to have that seemingly almost now it seems pseudo respectful funeral that they have with the folding of the flag and everything like that. But then his chief is saying that he's a coward without actually saying it. It's just it's sad, honestly.
Yeah. No, I just think that this sequence is it's the moment for me where I could see like Becker was given procedural detail on how a very strange, very harrowing crime went down, and he just slowed it down and matched the material. And I think it was absolutely the right call, and it was the most sort of intrigued by that, like the slow burn way that sequence is played out. And even, running through the barbed wire fence and hiding out in the tall grass, and, sort of the detail of the black farm worker who's like, this is white people's business. I don't want to get involved in any of this. Like there's a lot of, I think, great moments in this. And, it eventually leads to Jimmy sort of, driving away without Greg, and Carl showing the police and the medics the bloodied corpse, which is an image that stays with him, and Greg stealing a car from a guy living in a trailer and changing its, again, tons of great like detail that you can tell Wambaugh thought about in the in writing this true crime novel. But like the idea that he goes and he's smart enough to go to a motel and change the plates, but when he gets pulled over by the cop and he tries to do his like, sort of con man routine of being like, oh, sorry, I must swap my registration with my wife when I was getting in the other car, and oh, I'm so sorry, officer. And the officers literally open up the car and they're like, you have an irrigation shovel in here. You are not a city slicker. Like, what the fuck are, this is ridiculous. And, so there's details in here that just feel so specific and true to how stuff like this would go down that I think is really well done. And I was intrigued with this probably. No, I was still intrigued with this even when they got captured, because I think because the Jimmy crying during that whole altercation is a fantastic, insane detail that apparently was improvised by the actor, by the way. And him being captured and sort of interrogated was when I started thinking about In Cold Blood, just because it has that exact structure. The crime wraps up, they immediately put them into the interrogation room, and I think my brain immediately went, "Oh, this is going to get even more interesting. This is great." And I think that was around the time where I started realizing that, oh, this movie is not quite as interested in the viewpoints of, I think, that Capote, the larger scale things that Truman Capote, I think, is interested in. Because what's kind of funny about this movie, and I'm very curious for your thoughts on this, Sean, but like the motivating trauma of this movie, is it that cops aren't allowed to execute criminals?
I don't think.
Is this movie solved in Wambaugh's eyes by John Savage being able to go into that courtroom and shoot James Woods in the head, and this situation being dealt with and over, and everything's better?
I think that's a very funny way of framing it. I don't.
That's a very ungenerous way of framing that, but I will say that was the implication I kind of got as this movie went on, which I thought was very. And I think I only got to it because it was such the opposite view of Capote, who was weirdly sympathetic to the fact that the death penalty is an evil, nonsensical thing. Right. Whereas here, there's a lot of like, isn't it a travesty that these guys are able to exploit lawyers and judges to get off of death row, and continuing to re-traumatize this cop by having to be on the stand for 8 years, which is kind of what the story is for the second half of this movie.
I think, if you are being ungenerous, that is one way to pitch it. I think, it reminds me a little bit of the car chase sequence in the new Centurions, because in that scene, which is so thrilling, at least I, as a viewer, was just really hoping that Stacy Keach's character survived that incredible car chase, which is terrifying, because I was like, this motorist is in the wrong. This is fucking crazy that she just pulled off in the face of a police officer. On the flip side, that was an illegal stop and search, and he was under the influence working on the job at the time. Mm-hmm. So but for whatever reason, maybe because of the general structures that have been banged into my head as a person, and probably a lot in part because of my personal life and who my family is, there is this kind of sense of like this delineated right and wrong, that there is a thin blue line that actually exists. And in this story, the James Woods character is so profoundly evil and so without morality that you just want him to get a kind of comeuppance. And even after he has his moment of intellectual reckoning, and he kind of like evolves into this learned man who brings people under his wing, he's still so slimy, and he's still like such a self-aggrandizing egotist that you want a bad thing to happen to him. However, I do think that ultimately what is interesting at the heart of the series of real life events to Wambaugh is the way that these guys just kind of waited the system out. And the idea that they were able to appeal and push long enough for the state to change the law that eliminated the death penalty. It's not like they got the death penalty eliminated, but by living through the heinous crime and the way that the bureaucracy allowed them to kind of coast through that time in prison. And we see their like late lives in prison is like kind of gentle, and kind of like, they're kind of like librarians. And that's an interesting way to frame what is such a hypercharged, violent, masculine crime drama in the first hour. So I won't even really quibble with the way that you're framing it, Josh, because I do think that maybe in his heart of hearts, Wambaugh is like, they should have fucking shot these two guys in this onion field, and then they wouldn't have had to worry about this. But because it actually happened, like, you don't even really have to dramatically...
John Savage, 8 years of John Savage's marriage. He wouldn't have thought about abusing his child or putting a gun in his mouth if only these guys had been hanged.
Like, that's so... I mean, that's another thing. That's another stroke in this movie that is classic of Wambaugh's dramatic instincts, where the movie goes out of its way for 4 minutes to show us Savage sitting alone in his living room, listening to his screaming child, which I am a parent and I have been there, and it is a fucking brutal thing to have to live through. Now, I was never suicidal, nor did I ever wish harm on my child, but the fact that the movie makes you sit in that pain is really, really interesting and really unusual.
That's one of the best scenes, I think, for his section of the movie.
Yeah, and it's very, very memorable. And it's probably the one scene that isn't overplayed by Savage, because he doesn't really have any dialogue to play. He just has to wear on his face the trauma and the aftermath and the PTSD that you're talking about.
And also have to pretend that it's like not there when the other kid comes out, right? As well. And is like, Dad, the baby's crying, like, you need to go help the baby, and does that just as he's about to pull the trigger on himself, right? And it's again, it's it feels very in line with what we were talking about with New Centurions, and I honestly was expecting the trigger to just get pulled, honestly, based on following this up with that movie.
It does feel too, I think structurally it comes back to it one too many times. I understand that it's trying to interweave kind of like how Greg is trying to play the system with his PTSD, and the whole point really is that it's taking so long, and that's why it's even more strenuous for him. So I get why they're doing it. It's just it's just the structure of watching a film. There are so many times that I can go back to The Thing, where the guy's just dealing with more trauma, and most of that is him trying to do normal things in his life, but it's being interrupted by these thoughts. And it's like, I understand it. I have, some sympathy for it, but it's just I don't know. It felt like one too many times, and every single time I wanted to go back to Greg and Jimmy and see what was going on with them and the kind of...
He definitely does not give a shit about traditional movie pacing or entertainment when writing any of the stuff that he's doing in that second half, right? Like, and that's also why it's uniquely him and kind of interesting, but I do know what you mean, that it's like, it does make it where you go, oh, it's another sequence of him where it doesn't feel like, because I will say the one sequence we're talking about, the reason I think we jumped to that, because it feels like the one where they found another dimension to it. It feels like there's 5 other ones before it where it's hitting the same point, and I'm like, okay, you've done this.
That's what it is. I think I just got to that point where I said I get the point, and I understand, but it's just trying to do that cycle so that you understand how long these things take. I think it's supposed to be like a few years that this takes for
it's 8 years over the course of the film. Right. It's even longer than New Centurions. No, but he clearly likes this pace. He likes this sense of time is taking its toll on these guys. They're changing. Their lives are changing. The one detail of this I'll say that I don't think is funny, but it got a laugh out of me almost every time, was how haunting the bagpipes are in the movie. Every and now they're combined with slow motion images of this guy dying and him screaming and going back to this horrible situation. But there's a couple moments where they just have John Savage like walking around in a mall, and he's like thinking about buying a watch, and he's like trying to live normal domestic life. And then you just hear like evil bagpipes in the distance. Yeah, it is. And it was one of those things that, like, out of context, it's quite funny. But when you watch the movie, you do understand it. But that was one of those details of, there were a couple scenes where I was like, oh, the evil. In my notes somewhere, it's like, oh, the evil bagpipes are back. They are again.
It is interesting how often they use it, and how many different ways. Like in the beginning, it's kind of a form of his expression of himself, and then it becomes this haunting memory of the death, and then
becomes a sentimental thing in the final scene,
remembering him in more of an honorable way. So I don't think I've ever seen a film use bagpipes so often.
The young boy playing bagpipes at the end, and then the conversation with the mom, the Deus Ex bagpipes, is like a little much. Like they're really gilding the lily, but obviously that instrument And I believe that's true to Ian Campbell's story. Like Ted Danson, I read an interview with him where he talked about how important it was because that was true to the experience of that character. And Ted Danson also has Scottish heritage, so he talked about his appreciation for the bagpipes. But not only is it so specific, but bagpipes are obviously a funereal instrument. They're an instrument that is played at the funerals of law enforcement and soldiers. And so because of that, it doesn't feel like, it's not too maudlin that it makes the movie fall apart. He pushes hard on the button, but it actually makes sense given the context of the story.
It feels like that's what he does. Totally. He walks that line. He does stuff where I feel like I would roll my eyes out the back of my head if someone else was writing them. And I do feel like he cares about this stuff, and he's including these details because they're important and real to him. And that is what makes, I think, his stuff stand out, even if I look at it and I'm like, you're walking that line, man, where you're so close to crossing it.
You know what else is a good example of that too, is the kleptomania that Savage's character engages with, which is like not necessarily like that's not a consequence we think of in the aftermath of PTSD, but it is actually like there is a pathology there that you can understand. And that makes that character seem so weak and so broken. And it is so definitively the opposite of what a police officer is meant to do, to sort of like enact a crime as a means of expression of pain relative to what their career was and what was taken from them. That is so specific. And I've never seen that in another movie. I've never seen that as an expression of PTSD.
Yeah, the idea of becoming a shoplifter in order to get punished and get locked up and feel like, the survivor's guilt has kind of taken over his life. And, this really hits home with the sort of mental health capacity. There's one moment I thought was really nice with the wife, or not nice, but like, again, sort of that Wambaugh specific detail of the wife saying, I know that cops don't view it this way, but like there are like mental health doctors. You can talk to people. Multiple times she suggests that he does it. And he's like, I just like lost my job for being like a thief and ruined my reputation, don't have money. I can't afford a doctor for like our kid. I'm not going to a doctor because I have this weird shoplifting obsession. Like, I don't like it's one of those things where again, it's just so specific that you have to imagine that Wambaugh has seen something like this before and he's translating it.
Also, like the like technically you could just easily compare that scene with Jimmy earlier on when they're going through the interrogation, because he's just saying like I shouldn't be killed or put on life. I'm just a thief. I was just there. And then for him to have that scene later on, not John Savage's character to have that scene later on and saying the same thing, but in an opposite way. He's like, I am a thief and I should be in jail. While these two other dudes, one of them specifically not being Greg or James Woods' character, who is a wild man, is...
I like that line he has too in that same scene you're talking about where he's like, do you ever feel guilty? And he's like, I think that's something the rich white man made up, and I don't believe in that. Like, guilty is something a judge says in the court when your luck is run out. Just a very different sort of lifestyle and kind of worldview that the detective, played by Ronnie Cox in this case, which we just talked about Deliverance a few weeks ago, so it was nice to see Ronnie Cox again here, is the sort of detective who kind of goes like good cop mode on these guys in a way that I think the other cops would have, maybe not liked to have seen, like the fact that he's so helpful to the James Woods character in a way of getting him to speak, but I guess for him it's because it makes his job easier, and the fact that also he gets to pit sort of Jimmy and Greg sort of against each other in this way where they're like, if I'm going to the gas chamber, you're coming to the gas chamber with me, and they can't decide who it is who fired the first shot or who it is who fired, because we didn't mention it in the crime, but in the true details of the case, someone also fired 4 bullets basically into the corpse, and that's a specific detail that Wambaugh leaves pretty ambiguous. I think if you look really closely, you might be able to see James Woods doing it, but like the idea is meant to...
James Woods, you can't really tell, but just based on their
they're
height...
both holding 2 pistols far away in the darkness, and you're like, who is firing these shots into him?
I will say also, if you're just basing it off of like what we know is shown and then the performances, I wholeheartedly believe in Franklin Seal's performance when he's just like, I'm just a thief, I'm screaming. And then we know about Greg and his character and just how snaky he is and how manipulative he is and conniving he is. So it feels like even if it's ambiguous, there's I definitely have more trust for Jimmy.
I trust Jimmy's side of events more than I trust his, but they do even at one point get Jimmy to doubt his own side of the story, right? I mean, part of the big dramatic buildup of their relationship is for him to literally get down on his knees and agree to Greg's version of events in like a sort of in a power move, because, and I can't wait to talk about this. Because they are handed, and this was one of the most writerly things I've ever seen in a movie. Jimmy gets thrown into prison. It turns into a bleak prison film for a little bit. At one point, Greg and Jimmy are fighting, and Jimmy is so proud that he whoops his ass because it's Greg. It's very, again, sort of similar to the hitchhiker. It's like he's not anything without his gun. He doesn't have his power, his manhood. It's a different sort of situation. And he has this late night conversation with a neighboring prisoner in a cell across from him, played by Christopher Lloyd, who quite blatantly teaches him the loopholes, and it's like he has been in there researching and studying this, and he's like, so we're all on death row here, and we've been looking into how we can all get out of this, which is that, and he's like, and you guys have a gimmick, or you have a special secret to yours, which is that you have a multi-killer case, like the In Cold Blood case, which is that you can request an individual trial, a split trial from your partner, because of any sort of disagreement that you have, and then what you can do. And he literally gives him the exact, like, sort of like layman's play by play of how to pull this off. But you can basically call Jimmy to the stand in your case, and if you get you can call Greg to the stand in your case, called James Woods. I'm going to get this confused because one's James Woods and the other guy is Jimmy. But if you call James Woods to the stand for you, he can plead the fifth on whether he remembers putting those bullets into the guy or not. And then the jury will think that he did it, and they will get you off of death row. And if he does that, then you're good. And you can, and then they kind of imply that maybe he can do it for the other guy too. And there's this weird thing where they're like, here's the loophole to get both of you guys off death row. And that's why Jimmy is then kind of forced to kind of make up with him. And he also just doesn't want to become one of the guys who's in there. One of the few scenes they see is a guy just strip naked and slit his own wrist and put the blood on his head and talk about himself, how he's going to save them all like Jesus. And again, another just hyper specific sequence where you're just like, I mean, clearly Wambaugh read about a guy doing this or something like that, because it's pretty horrifying. But the detail of Christopher Lloyd, speaking of Deus Ex Machina kind of stuff, just being there to be like, Jimmy,
here you go.
Here is the exact strategy. Here's the exact, the part in the rule book where it says a dog can't play basketball. Here it is. I've highlighted it for you. And they go through that exact detail of this, exactly what they do to get him off. And James Woods' performance when he gets on the stand and he's just like, I plead the fifth, Your Honor, stares directly into the souls of every jury member. It's it was quite a strange leap, I think, how I guess I felt that the cops stuff was so frequently handled with a level of real authenticity and detail and sympathy, that the legal stuff was the complete opposite. I think Wambaugh had some bad experiences with these guys, because that one lawyer who's even just like, I would set both of those guys free if it meant that I could execute some judges and lawyers today or something like that.
That's what's interesting about it too, is that he must have a little bit of personal grievance, because and correct me if I'm wrong, but those two characters are kind of like just side characters, and they have a scene together where they're just in a room talking about that kind of system, the court system. And it does feel as if he's having a moment to just be like, this is what I'm pissed off about. And even when they deal with like the stuff in comparison, I mean, especially with John Savage, because it's just trauma and PTSD and everything. So it's when it goes back to Greg, he's even getting to a point where he's mocking the court system and like making jokes about, like he tells the lawyer and the cop to quiet down because he's working on his newest case or whatever.
His motions.
Yes, his motions. Like he's mocking everybody at a certain
point.
Because
he's reading law books in prison, and he's got his little glasses on at a certain point. And he's figured out how to play the con man shit we saw didn't work for him on the street. It's working for him in the legal system. And that's something that Wambaugh is very, very deliberately showing you. And honestly, it's why the James Woods character kind of slips away a little bit in the movie, because his dynamic totally changes. He gets so much more not an animal cornered into doing unhinged violence, and not this kind of, he becomes a weirdly kind of stronger character there.
He does, yeah.
And it kind of becomes the lawyers and the judges who are weak in comparison to him, because they don't realize they're playing him.
That part of the film just feels like there's just this raft of introductions of new figures in the story who we have no relationship to that point. The Lloyd character is a version of that. The lawyers are a version of that. And that are just like not fully realized, that feel more like chess pieces that they're moving around rather than some of the dynamic human drama that's happening either between Jimmy and Greg, or Savage and his wife, or, in the aftermath of Ian's death, his colleagues. So I don't know. I think you're right, Josh, that like that's really his axe to grind, and that's the thing that is motivating him wanting to tell the story. But it's the stuff that is the least dramatic about the story, and so the movie is kind of flawed because those two things are not really synced together.
That's a good way of putting it. That's how I felt watching it, because the first half had such a powerful slow burn and a build up to it, and even the early stuff when they first get captured, and the early stuff with the PTSD, and I really was like, it felt like Wambaugh was so invested in all of this stuff, and it really did kind of feel like he got just a little bit broader than he usually does when he was like, we're going to get into these courtroom proceedings. It just got more ridiculous, and it got more, and honestly, what's interesting is that I don't think he's being untrue. Like, all these details are probably 100% correct. It's just the level of focus and the level of compassion he gives to the drama for certain characters versus other ones, I think speaks to how he feels about them. And that is where it feels like the movie kind of lost me a little bit. And I did feel that, again, it was what I think led to my more maybe ungenerous view of how he was what exactly he was saying about the fact that, man, if only this cop didn't have to experience PTSD for 8 years and the justice system wasn't a piece of shit and had executed these guys sooner, is kind of what it feels like the implication of the movie is, even if I don't think Wambaugh, it very could be inadvertently, I don't think Wambaugh, of all the things he's expressed in these two movies that we've seen, I don't get the idea that he's like gung-ho about the death penalty. It's just interesting that by broadening out some of the drama, he maybe accidentally arrived at that idea. But in some ways too, that made this very kind of fascinating. I still was engaged throughout the whole second half of the movie. I was just more questionable about the things that I was watching. So that was kind of where it kind of ended up for me as we devolved into the two sides here, and especially where they kind of end up, which I did think was interesting. I did think that for Greg and Jimmy, he ends up going so far because he had written this book in 1972. So it had been a long time, and he had extra things that he could incorporate, which is that like these guys were able to fight for getting off death row and be coming up for parole. I think they say that they're coming up for parole in like the mid 80s or something like that. And you can look into the details of it. It turns out actually that, especially for Greg, he did not get out on parole. I guess there was some sort of like third-party justice groups who fought for the fact that this guy should not be getting out, and they did successfully manage to keep him in prison for life until 2012, I guess. But there is an ambiguity hanging over the movie for Wambaugh, which is that 8 years went by. These guys were able to get this court case functionally thrown out, or at least the death penalty aspect of it thrown out. And these guys are going to be possibly on the streets in 5 years post this movie coming out. And I think he wants to make you kind of think about that a little bit. And the fact that they were both changed by that experience. It's not quite the same as... what's that Riz Ahmed miniseries that Stephen Knight did? The night, that exactly. That's one I always think about when I think about a show that frustrated people because it wasn't a procedural. It was just about how the prison system shapes a person, and I felt a little bit of hints of Wambaugh wanting to get how James Woods becomes this more sort of erudite, master manipulator style character, and how Jimmy honestly becomes older and more kind of settled, more comfortable in the prison. I mean, at one point he literally admits that maybe he is better off in here. He understands it better. He's the one who doesn't want to put his own adopted mother on the stand during that crazy sequence when they're trying to get the parents to explain why they shouldn't be on death row. And, you know, there's an interesting, you know, still sort of ending place for this outside of maybe, I don't know how you guys felt about the beats for Carl, where I got a great landscaping job on the onion field where my friend was shot, and I don't hear the bagpipes anymore.
Right for you. That's
Yay!
We're all good.
Trauma's
He's
done.
going to be happy.
Yep. Trauma over.
Yep.
It was
He's gonna
that
get to
easy.
Go on a picnic with his wife, and they're going to play in the lake. It's going to be fine.
They're gonna frolic in that onion field now.
Yeah,
great.
I don't know that quite one worked for me either, to be honest.
It is. It feels a little clean and just kind of like, yeah, him just saying all these nice things now. It's like, and also, my PTSD gone. Don't even worry about it anymore.
It's
it does
kind
feel
of
a little
character, right? For Wambaugh too.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't usually let you off the hook. And he's kind of
especially compared to Keach just getting gut shot at the end of the new Centurions. Like, it is very different in that sense.
The difference between 72 and 79, though, in terms of what a movie.
There you go. That's what it is.
It's on its way. The nihilism is on its way out. The 80s
maximalists. True.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's spot on. But. Yeah, but yeah, maybe pivoting towards reductive rating around here on the onion field. This one still ended up honestly getting to 2-3 territory for me. It was more of a sort of lighter 3. I did have more flaws, I think, with this than I did with New Centurions. And I'll be honest, watching this made me kind of go, oh, maybe I had less problems with New Centurions than I thought. And maybe now that I've seen more Wambaugh, and maybe I'll go and watch the Choir Boys and stuff too, and go see some other ones. I have a feeling I'm going to come back to New Centurions and kind of appreciate that one as maybe a more well handled and I think better directed example of, you know, his project here of, you know, making cop weepies with enough like genuinely just grounded and gritty and upsetting real life detail that they kind of overpower maybe some of the more mechanical gears that you feel within them, and definitely are so specific and so again raw that I really do think there's something of value to what it is that he's translating. And to see him more directly here be the one who's even writing the script and have so much power over the project to even make this one work less maybe as a conventional crime drama or thriller or movie in that way, and to just really lean into the strangeness of this real life story of this kidnapping and execution and the legal system sort of loopholing and obviously the PTSD. And again, there's sort of ups and downs with it, but I think for the most part, most of the acting is fantastic. I think that John Savage has maybe some of the hardest stuff to sell, or at least the stuff that's the most out of his register at a couple moments, as Sean kind of put it earlier. But James Woods is fantastic. And I did really like Franklin Seals as Jimmy as well, and even briefly Ted Danson. He does own his role of Ian up until the point where he dies. And again, that first slow burn half for me of just the fatalistic hangout buildup of both of these pairs of men and the worlds that they live in and how they're about to collide in this sort of unhinged act of sort of senseless violence, I think is incredibly well done. And I think because of how Wambaugh was so dedicated to getting the procedural detail of what happened in that bizarre situation down exactly as it went down, Becker just followed it to a T, and it ends up being a really, really fantastic sequence. And it's really only in the second half when we get into Wambaugh definitely feeling like he has some personal grievances against lawyers and judges and the legal system that he doesn't quite show the same amount of sympathy and complexity to that it is that he offers. I think honestly, even the criminals in this movie, even if James Woods is an absolutely evil man, I think Jimmy is treated with much more interest and compassion. So yeah, I don't know. I definitely think this kind of started to fall apart for me in the second half, but there was still enough in there. Again, the scene of John Savage and abusing his child and nearly committing suicide is absolutely harrowing. And even some of the stuff with James Woods and Jimmy in the prison is ridiculous enough to still be a little funny, even if it's bordering on, are you trying to say that we should bring the death penalty back. I don't know.
I will say, I think I align with you very closely on how I feel about the movies, Josh. Obviously, they've made for like interesting movies to discuss. I think you'll find when you see Choir Boys that it's very different tonally from both of these movies. And I think that I agree, New Centurions is the best adaptation of his work. I have always wanted to see a TV miniseries called Echoes in the Darkness, which was adapted from one of his other nonfiction books that he wrote way after he retired from the police force and was an established crime writer, which is about the murder of a high school English teacher in Pennsylvania. And the miniseries came out in 1987, but it has an amazing cast. It's Treat Williams, Peter Coyote. Yeah, Stockard Channing, Peter Boyle, Gary Cole, Robert Loggia. It's kind of a stacked cast. I've never seen this before, but I'm quite interested in it. And Wambaugh wrote like 15 books. I mean, he was extremely prolific in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So there's a lot to explore there.
Yeah. I think I'm in the 3 territory too. I feel pretty much the same as you guys. I do feel like the two worlds colliding, or the lead up, was much stronger than when they actually kind of melt together and they're going back and forth between his PTSD and the court system. I do think, though, what does save that second half is James Woods. Just watching him manipulate the system and everything is very fun, and he's just he's so great at playing a slimy character that I could watch it endlessly. So I do still get a lot of entertainment out of the second half, and still with John Savage is very good with what he's given. It's just I think it becomes very repetitive, unfortunately, and it's kind of one of those things where it's like, I understand that the point is also to keep hammering it home and create this sense of time. But it gets a little bit like, I understand. And it doesn't feel like it's saying anything new as it goes on. And it is still like a good, 45-minute chunk of the movie. So I just feel like it needed maybe a slight restructure, or I don't know how they would have tackled it, but it just didn't fully work for me like the first half does. But I do think the acting's great. Some of the direction is honestly awesome. I do love that whole onion field sequence. I think is great, very harrowing, and I think accents the proper moments with these close-ups and slow motion, and the use of the bagpipes. I honestly think works, strangely enough. So yeah, solid 3.
All right. Well, I think that is going to wrap it up for The Onion Field and for this week's episode. That was once again The New Centurions from 1972 and The Onion Field from 1979. Thanks so much, Sean, for joining us and for having us watch these films and sharing with us your passion for Wambaugh, which was just someone who really was not on our radar. I don't know when we would have got around to do this, and I'm very glad we did. So thank you.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Anytime.
Yeah. While we've got you here, is there anything going on in big picture world, or anything you want to promote while you're here?
We're doing the show twice a week, every week, sometimes 3 times a week. We're counting down.
Any more live shows?
Yeah. I can't announce. Well, they said this coming out in 2 weeks, right? So
2 weeks, yeah.
Yeah, we're doing a live show in New York in October, which I'm really excited about. More on that soon.
Awesome.
Pegged to the New York Film Festival, which is cool. And I'm screening Michael Clayton at the Arrow Theater in Los Angeles at the end of August, which
what a picture
is a 5-star masterpiece that we can all agree on.
Yeah. Yep.
So those will be fun. You guys are starting to do this too, and it's really just fun to see a movie you love with a big crowd.
Yeah, no, I'm hoping we get to do more screenings down the line, and thanks to anyone who attended our screening, since you guys will be listening to this after the fact, if you did. For our listeners, we're going to be back in 1 week's time, where we're actually going to be over on the Patreon feed, no longer doing high and low, which is what we were supposed to be doing, because you guys fucking voted for it. I left a poll open for you guys to vote on our next patron voted episode, and you guys voted for one that we had planned to do. So that is now going to be delayed. So all you did was make high and low later in your viewing experience.
But you do have the power, though.
You did pair it with The Bad Sleep Well, so I'm very interested in that double feature. It's one of the Kurosawas I've actually not seen, so I'm excited to talk about both of those. So instead, actually, we're going to be going classic Sleazoids mode. We're going to be talking about Witchboard and and Witchboard 2, because apparently there is a Chuck
Sick.
Russell remake of the original Kevin Teeny film coming out soon. And I've never seen these. It's a good excuse to finally watch these. I'll be honest, had to substitute it last minute because you guys have good taste, unfortunately. So that's what we're going to be talking about over on the Patreon next week. And then in 2 weeks' time, oh my God, I can't believe I have to say this out loud. We are going to be talking about some horror pornos, I believe. One called A Woman's Torment and one called Through the Looking Glass. And I do think that these are meant to have a sort of feminist angle to them. One is directed by Roberta Findlay. I trust the trash fiends who are bringing these films on. And we do like to carve out at least one space a year for people we know.
One porno a year.
Who, you know, usually it's Will Sloan, but that's fine. We will allow someone else to do it this year. And yeah, they do look like very striking movies. So that's all I can say about them. I've not seen them, but I trust that our exploitation guests who are bringing these movies on are quite knowledgeable about this genre, and I'm excited to learn a little bit about it. So that's what you can expect over in 2 weeks' time, which is a bit of a left field from your picks here, Sean. But that's
hey, they don't call us Sleazoids for nothing.
Every once in a while, we have to live up to our name, and that's what we're doing in 2 weeks. So we'll look forward to that. But yeah, that being said, that wraps up for everything this week. Thanks so much for listening, and keep it sleazy.
Keep it sleazy, everybody.